Ladies and gentlemen, we're running a few minutes late. We had to make sure we had a quorum. We have an excellent panel discussion this morning, so we want to get right to it. And I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions on it, so let's get started. So, Matthew, Dr. Owen, you ready?
Yes.
I'm sorry, Dr. Owen. Anyone have any questions or comments before we get started, or any personal matters, personal orders you'd like to take up? All right, thank you. Dr. Owen.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, members. Before we get to our panel, just as a brief review, Public Chapter 819 Acts of 2018 made changes to state law governing the deployment of small wireless facilities for providing broadband internet service. It also directed the Commission to study the effect of the Act on broadband deployment, the Act's fiscal impact on local governments, and the state related to the administrative procedures for permitting for small wireless facilities. And it directed the Commission to identify best practices from the perspective of providers and from the local and state entities responsible for permitting small wireless facilities, as well as a review of other states, and to identify opportunities to advance transportation in the state through applications supported by small wireless facilities. At our September meeting, we heard presentations that provided an overview of small wireless facilities and how they fit into the evolution of mobile wireless networks, as well as a presentation on small wireless facilities and how they could support transportation advancements in the state. For today's panel, we have several experts who will be discussing the Act's effect on providers and the state and local government entities responsible for permitting small wireless facilities. We have Mr. Vernon GERTH, the Assistant City Administrator for the City of Franklin, Jeff Hogue, Director for the Right-of-Way Division for the Tennessee Department of Transportation, and JOELLE PHILLIPS, the President of AT&T Tennessee. Before our panelists begin, I just want to thank them for their help with staff for this project. And I will also mention that representatives for the Tennessee County Services Association, the Tennessee Electric Cooperative Association, and the Tennessee Municipal Electric Power Association have agreed to be available to answer questions if needed. One more thing. The Act directs the Commission to report the results of its study, including any recommendations, to the General Assembly by January 1st of 2021. If there are no other questions for me about the study, I'm happy to ask our panelists to come forward.
Members, any questions before we get started? Seeing none. All right, let's call the panel forward.
Thank you.
I guess we're going to follow the order we have here. Each of you, thank you for your time and attention and your valuable assistance to us in this matter. Mr. GERTH, I think by list we're going to start with you. If you'll introduce yourself. And
thank you, Matt, and thank you, Chairman and members, for inviting me here today. My name is Vernon GERTH. I'm one of the Assistant City Administrators with the City of Franklin. My responsibilities focus on community and economic development. I've been with the city for 13 years, and previous to that had worked in similar capacity in the Midwest. With me today is my colleague and works closely with the installation of small cells facilities, Daniel Brady, who is seated behind me, and hopefully later, if you have some questions, he may be able to add even a deeper insight into the deployment of small cell facilities. What I'd like to do in the short time of this initial presentation is to provide you a little overview and context of not only why the deployment of small cell facilities and 5G is important to us all, but also some of the experiences that we have from a plan review and permitting standpoint and also a construction standpoint. And I also want to emphasize that while I'm sharing with you that, I'm going to offer some recommendations. Because as I get started here, first and foremost, I hope we all agree that the deployment of 5G technology is essential as we grow our communities and the state. And with that, 5G will provide the opportunity to connect millions of devices and with instantaneous response. And that improves the quality of life for all our citizens. And equally important, it helps businesses compete globally. And as we look to build our local economy, that's important. It's important for a security standpoint, a safety standpoint, for healthcare, and endless other services and needs that enhance the quality of life that we have available to us. In Franklin, we've been blessed, many of you may know that, with the amount of private investment in our community. To the tune over the last 2 to 2.5 years of $1.7 billion of private investment. That's a big deal for a community of 80,000 in Williamson County. So we realize who builds communities. It's the citizens that buy homes, it's the businesses that invest in their businesses, expand their businesses, and employ people. So time to market is important. No different than what we're talking about here today, and that's really where I'm going to focus my attention, is how can we deploy 5G technology more effectively? Understandably, that with the amount of investment we experience in the city of Franklin, we're in a unique position to understand how people, businesses, contractors coordinate their work. Similarly, those contractors, when they come to a city like Franklin, we ask them what we can do better, because as we compete as a local community, we want to be as efficient in our development services as possible. So I share that with you because that's the perspective that we have in helping businesses and their development teams get to market and put people in their homes and businesses providing their services and products. So what I'd like to start with this morning is to try to focus in a little bit on the planning and permitting aspects. And I'm going to point out maybe 4 or 5 areas where there should be improvement. And then I'll follow those up with some recommendations. First of all, the planning and the plans that are submitted for review are fragmented. They're not inclusive of putting the poles in, making sure the electric and fiber are ready to be connected. And some poles are installed for several months before the electric and fiber is even connected. And it's taking somewhere, in some cases, 10 to 14 months to complete an installation once work's out in the field. We may have conduit coming out of the ground in the public right-of-way, the grass strip between the sidewalk and a curb, with some cones around it. Or a generator operating, sitting on the sidewalk or in the parkway for a period of time until the electric can be put in. Design engineers are really not doing their due diligence to ensure facilities are not placed over existing infrastructure, and that electric and fiber can be routed to the locations. The project gets permitted, we're paying a lot of attention to time, or the plans, which costs us time and money. But it also costs the provider time and money too, because we're trying to do some of that troubleshooting for them to help make an efficient installation. The lack and disregard of proper notice and coordination of inspections from the various subcontractors. And I want to say the providers, when we contact them, are responsive, but they're farming this out to subcontractors, so the lack of coordination is very evident, and it's not efficient. So the companies, as I mentioned, the AT&T, the Verizon, the Sprints, T-Mobiles, they're reasonable to work with. But once the approval is turned over and the permits to the subcontractors, some of them show a disregard for coordinating the inspections and the installations. We've learned that coordinating with the electric utilities and fiber companies is woefully lacking. I mean, as I mentioned, if you can think about the building of a single-family home, generally that can be done in 4 to 5 months. And we're talking about putting a pole in the ground, running fiber and electric to it that's taking 10 or 14 months in some cases. That's unacceptable, in my opinion, because we want to deploy the technology, but we want it done in a workmanlike manner as well. Because with as much growth as we have, we need to ensure that there's enough room in the right-of-way for all the utilities, sewer, water, storm sewer infrastructure, other fiber lines, underground electric. There's also an issue that I'll talk about the attractiveness of some of the poles, but the good news is that with the changing technology and evolving so much, some of the poles that we were initially looking at 2-3 years ago, they've become more streamlined and certainly fit in the character of the streetscape in neighborhoods. Although sometimes there's wood poles being installed that don't add to the value of the neighborhood, and that causes concern from residents and even businesses that have made a substantial investment in our community. I believe also subcontractors are confused between what private property is and private property easements are to the public right-of-way, and thinking they're one and the same. And obviously that's not true. A private property easement has private ownership, as well as the easement may have certain restrictions on it. Those things that I've just mentioned in the plan review of permitting put an extra burden on the city. And that plan review fee for a group of facilities is not sufficient when the design engineers are not doing their due diligence. So what are some of the recommendations in the plan review and permitting? Comprehensive planning and plan preparation are critical. Plans need to be accurately reflect the location of a facility, the routing of the fiber, and the routing of the electric service. We recommend that the electric service and fiber companies sign off on those plans before they're submitted to the city, so then when the permit is issued, it can be coordinated and executed in a timely manner. Limit the number of facilities on a plan that's submitted at one time, so it can be in an area. So the focus can be on routing the electric and fiber to those poles instead of looking at a broader area. In some parts of our community or other communities, that should help reduce the amount of time and effort to get facilities installed. Also, since we realize the deployment of 5G technology is important, we will help the companies look at their plans as we're doing now, but we should be able to recapture that additional time that we're spending reviewing plans, coordinating with electric companies, the fiber lines, making repeated inspections, looking at those plans. So I would ask that there's an additional fee added or able to be added for when we're reviewing and permitting these facilities. Construction and inspection. Once permits have been issued to subcontractors, we're finding they're deviating from the approved plans and excavating and installing the poles not in the location that are on the plans. They say, well, it's in the area. Well, in the area isn't good enough. We have sewer, water, electric infrastructure, and when and if a fiber line, for example, got cut, that puts people out of business. That's a big deal. And that's why we want to spend the time on getting the plans right and the locations right so we can move forward in an efficient manner. In residential neighborhoods, there's no courtesy being provided to homeowners and/or individual property owners when the facilities will be put in a residential neighborhood. There's a natural concern about what these poles are providing. Yes, people want instantaneous connectivity, but there are some residents out there that have a concern that or a perception that it's going to cause some health concerns to them or their children. It also takes away, some people believe, from the investment. That's why I'll talk about later that we have to have a recognition, and there's some of that, of the type of pole going in a neighborhood that has paid attention to those details when in neighborhoods as far as street light poles and other types of utility poles if there's above ground electric. To help reduce the impact in residential neighborhoods, but it could be throughout the community in commercial neighborhoods, there doesn't seem to be a desire or emphasis on co-locating facilities on poles. And that was something that we had discussed, as some of you may know, a number of years ago when the city was working with the providers to develop its own ordinance locally, which in many respects is the framework for this state legislation that we have today. We spent quite a bit of time trying to work with the providers, already knowing how important it was to have this technology deployed in our city, but we wanted to try to reduce the impact on numerous poles being installed. We're also finding that some of the subcontractors are not installing breakaway poles in the right-of-way. That's a safety concern. So when we find that, guess what happens? We got to go back to the provider, the subcontractors, and say, remove it. That's not efficient. Once the approved installation, and I talked about that the installations are just not completed in a predictable and timely manner and they drag out. We've got to try to improve upon that if we're getting this technology deployed. So the recommendations that I share with you from the construction and inspection standpoint, and they're on the handout that you've been provided, is to provide a point of contact to be included on the permit application that's responsible for the entire installation, from permitting or plan review, permitting, and construction for the pole installation, the fiber installation, and the electric. In residential neighborhoods, particular detached single-family neighborhoods, I recommend providing a courtesy. That company provide a courtesy to residents within about 250 feet of where that pole's being installed. It's a way to bridge the gap or that perception that government's just going to do what they want without regard to the people that are building and investing in neighborhoods. Provide guidelines and requirements for the co-location and type of facilities. We're not engineers, but there would certainly seem an opportunity to co-locate more facilities and instead of each entity having their own pole. The poles should really be black or bronze to match the existing poles in the neighborhood, even if there's wood in the neighborhood today. A shot clock or performance deadline should be implemented and defined with a subsequent penalty if the installation isn't completed in a timely manner. Yeah, as I talked to Daniel and our team and some of the subcontractors, if it was coordinated, it should be able to be completed in a couple months. We'd be happy today if there was a deadline of 4 to 5 months, just so it's not dragging out almost a year. And if there was a penalty, because that usually gets the attention, or maybe not issuing any more permits until we get poles completed that had already been approved and permitted. And again, if we're making re-inspections, the city should be able to recapture our cost of service by assessing fees for those additional inspections. I would offer in closing here today, and I apologize if I'm taking a little bit too long, is that I do believe the providers, as well as their marketing, what 5G technology means to us as citizens and businesses, to also reach out and do some marketing about whether or not, or addressing the public outcry or perception that locating facilities near schools, child care centers could cause health issues with them. I want to thank you for allowing me to be here, and Daniel and I are certainly available to answer any questions as you proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Gerth, what's the pleasure of the commission? You want to hold questions? You want to do it now? All right, go ahead.
We appreciate you being here this morning. Just a quick question on the shot clock. Has there been any thought given to requiring like a performance bond that the utility would post until such time that the work is completed and signed off by the city?
Well, we could do that, and in Franklin, we require letters of credit, so we can call on them quickly instead of maybe a traditional performance bond issued by the city. That requires monitoring and as well. To us, this isn't a complex installation if the pole installer, the electric company, and the fiber company are aligned. And this may sound odd, we're not big on bureaucracy. We're here to get installations installed, buildings built. Let people make investments, again, as I said, that build communities. We provide the framework so their investments add value and enhance the quality of life for the citizens.
All right, thank you, Mr. Clifton. Mayor Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gerth, thank you for your presentation. I was looking at number 5 on the first page regarding private property easements and public right-of-way and the confusion between those two. More and more I'm getting calls from property owners, private property owners, to say, hey, listen, someone's out here on my property and they're fiddling with my utility or my cable or my internet connection, and I didn't know anything about it. These have the right to come on my property without any permission from me and doing anything. How does the city of Franklin respond to a citizen when they make a call like that?
Well, as I had mentioned, the city of Franklin may be a little unusual, but even if we're trimming trees between the sidewalk and the curb, that's not a private property ownership. We'll notify the residents out of courtesy that we're working there. But any utility that may have an easement on private property is still obligated to let the property owner who owns the ground notice that they're going to be doing work. Yes, they have right to do that, and if a property owner, one of our residents, calls us, you can bet we'll follow up. Because we hope they've applied for a permit, but again, some of the subcontractors that utility companies hire have a disregard for that. And we try to apply penalties where we can, but we want to make sure that the citizens are being notified.
So, Mr. Gerth, let me make sure I understand. You're saying that the company, the contractor, has an obligation to contact the property owner ahead of time?
It's private property, in our opinion. Yes, they have a utility. There's an easement there. Let's say it's the electric utility that's running electric back between properties. The electric utility has the right to maintain their utility and anybody else that has infrastructure in it, but it's still private property, and they should notify the residents. That's our expectation. And that's why I've said that's a recommendation that in this act, that should be a requirement to help reduce that.
Thank you.
All right.
May I add as well, I'm JOELLE PHILLIPS with AT&T, and one thing that may be kind of a complicating factor in y'all's perception about this is that different counties, different municipalities have different rules about those kinds of general utility easements. There are private easements that we sometimes obtain where we pay the property owner, and there'll be basically a property contract that says what the rules are about coming on the property to use it for that easement purpose. But for the kind of general utility easements that most cities have, on the plat, it will say along the back of properties or different areas that there's a general utility easement. There are usually a set of rules about that kind of thing. And in some cases, there may not be as much of a requirement if you're there to fix something in an emergency or for a safety issue versus coming in to do new deployment. And there is something of a patchwork of those across the state. And I think most of the communications companies would probably welcome some uniformity across the state in how those kinds of rules worked.
Yeah, and when a vendor contracts, or when a citizen contracts with a vendor for internet service or TV service or a bundle, whatever, is there anything in the contract between the citizen and the company that's providing the service that allows the contractor, subcontractor for the company to come on private property without permission? The first question I get
Right.
from these folks is, did I sign something when I signed up for this that says these folks can come on my property? They're not necessarily against them coming on the property to take care of what they need to, but they're confused about, from a legal standpoint, are these folks supposed to get my permission, or can they just come on my property anytime and do what they want?
I think that's an excellent question, and one that I can't speak to across the industry for sure. There may be differences with different companies about that, but I'll definitely follow up. But my recollection is that, at least as to AT&T, there probably are terms and conditions when you sign up for service that reference back to will follow the rules in your locality. If we're talking about an individual private property owner where we're going to actually do something to their property, dig a trench, on their private property, we would engage them in negotiation of an easement. The exception may be where there's an aerial drop between, a line at the street and an aerial drop to the property. And my guess is when you make the appointment for installation, that might be the point at which permission is gained. But as a general matter, I think we mostly refer back to will comply with the local rules for utility easements, et cetera.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments before we go to Mr. Hogue? All right, Mr. Hogue, you ready? Thank you for being here.
Can you hear me?
Is your light on? Little red light?
There's a red light on.
All right, you're good.
Good morning, I'm Jeff Hogue. I'm with the Tennessee Department of Transportation. I'm the director of the Right-of-Way Division. I have Michael Horlacker with me. He's our state utility coordinator, our general counsel, John Reinbold, and then Brian Carroll from our legislative office. Mine will be brief. I'll give you a little background. Back in October of 2015, we developed some guidelines for small cells. We consider them a utility, and as been stated earlier, we want them, first of all, to co-locate on an existing pole. If there are power lines out there, we want them on those poles first. In general, TDOT doesn't feel it's appropriate for small cells to attach to our structures, signs, bridges, things like that. But if an application is made, we would look at it on a case-by-case basis. And the regional director has the discretion to allow the utility or the small cell to install their own pole or above-ground cabinets, anything like that. We obviously don't allow the large cell towers on our right-of-way. We followed that guideline since 2015. The only thing that's really changed since the Act, the Small Cell Act, is the charging of the fees. We charge $100 for the first 5 and then $50 for an additional 5. They can submit up to 10 sites in one application. We were concerned about, it said with the locals, they had 60 days to approve the application, and they could get another 25 or another 15. We had an out that said we could take longer if we notified them. Our understanding from our regional offices, we're getting it well within the 60 days in the application that we receive. So our policy still applies, and the law said that TDOT doesn't have to reimburse the utility, the small cell, on one of our highway projects. So as of today, a small cell will come to us. They'll complete a use and occupancy permit application, just like any other utility. They'll pay their fees. They have up to 1 year to install that facility or those facilities. And our concerns, I think Mr. Gerth said earlier, is their ability, if we allow a small cell to set their own pole, is their willingness to allow another one to co-locate on that pole. We don't want our right-of-way littered with poles. It's a safety issue, a clear zone issue. You know, with our relocation projects, obviously the more utilities you have on a highway project, the more opportunity you have for construction delays. And then there is some concern that maybe possibly they abandon their poles on our right-of-way but don't remove them. And then just a little brief, we have not experienced the application number that we thought we would. From July of 18, for those 6 months, we're broken down by region. Region 1 received 1 application, Region 2 received 0, Region 3, 31, and Region 4 just 1 application. As of last year, for all of 2019, Region 1 received 23, Region 2, 6, Region 3, 47, and Region 4, 16. So we had anticipated like we would be bombarded with applications, and so far we're not seeing that. Region 2 is the lowest.
Yeah. Questions, comments? Mayor McDonald.
Mr. Hogue, I want to be sure I understood what you said. You said, as I understood it, you'd like to have no more than 10 sites on a single application?
Yes, sir.
And did I hear you say $100 for the first, was it 5?
It's $100. It'd be $500 for each site. It would be $100, and then if it's up to 5 sites after that, it's just $50.
And that's, so if I give you an application for 10 sites, and then I come back and give you another one for 10, I'm going to pay the $100 for the first 5 and $50 for the balance on the second application?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, thank you.
All right, other questions or comments? Thank you, Mr. Hogue. Ms. Phillips, you ready? President Phillips, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all about the impact of the small cell law that was passed in 2018. And I think I'm not being too proud about it, but I love to talk about this law with my colleagues from other states because it has worked much better here than it has in many other states. And I think the proof of the value of it is in the numbers of small cells that we have deployed in Tennessee. You know, small cells, initially, the first use of small cells is to handle the density of traffic on a network. So, you know, a lot of times you think about infrastructure being added to expand the geographic footprint, but in this instance, we started to recognize this dramatic demand for wireless bandwidth in particularly populated areas, and small cells allowed us to make that existing infrastructure handle more capacity. So the first step is that density. The second thing that we will use these small cell types of infrastructure to do will be to support 5G kind of next generation additional speeds and bandwidth. So it is a thing driven by population, at least in the beginning. So Tennessee is the 17th most populous state in the nation. And we're not, you know, 17th makes it sound, is a little deceptive because the ones in the top 5, you know, are dramatically more populous than we are. But we're 12th in the nation for AT&T in the number of small cells we have deployed here. So when you think about, you know, our ability to outpace our population by that amount, it's because the process in Tennessee is so much more manageable for us that when my colleagues in other states have gotten capital budgeted for them to do infrastructure projects and they can't get the permits they need, I have been able to take some of that capital from those states that can't use it and get it deployed here. And it's really absolutely a function of the law. If we were just left to the network demands, obviously we would go to the most populous places first. So, our experience has been incredibly positive. The FCC's order on small cells, which came out after the Tennessee law, is another good example of how smart that policy has been. The FCC's order, if you're having a hard time going to sleep and you want to read a lot of footnotes, the FCC order is a great sleep aid, but a lot of those footnotes reference the Tennessee bill. It was really highlighted as a best practice, and so in that sense, when my colleagues in other states complain that I'm taking their budget, I always remind them that we helped move the needle at the FCC for them by passing our good law. When we think about the coming years and the sort of the pace of this, Tennessee was really smart to act when it did, because we are right now in this unprecedented industry-wide investment phase in small cells. So even the states that later come along and try to emulate what we've done have missed this kind of historic moment where every large communications company was going all in on small cells. And so I think that is also going to serve us well as we get to that kind of next phase of adding on to support 5G. The FCC expects that across the country, the eventual number of small cells that we'll need are about 800,000. And that's all across the entire United States. There are estimates about how that breaks down to different companies. Obviously, I can't tell you forward-looking things about what we'll invest, but I think most industry analysts assume about 200,000 of those will be AT&T across the entire country. And, we're in pretty good stead. But so far in 2018, nationally, we were, a little over 2,000. By 19, that had gone up to about 5,000, and we anticipate, another 10,000 for 2020. That 200,000 we kind of anticipate we'll get to is probably going to occur over about a 7-year period. And I think you're going to see some trends as we get further along that really speak to some of the things that Mr. Gerth raised about Franklin. Co-location will become more attractive further along, because this first phase of trying to deal with the density needs, because the different networks are designed differently, it's kind of unlikely that Verizon is going to need a small cell in exactly the same place that AT&T or Sprint or T-Mobile will. But as we come back and continue this further densifying, we're going to see more opportunity to put things in the same place. And the other reason why we'll see more of that is that we're seeing a lot of opportunity now once there is one small cell in place, or even once there is some similar kind of infrastructure, even if it's not our own. Sometimes all we have to do is put a SIM card in that same structure. So rather than having to go through the whole thing about new fiber, new electricity, this process is going to continue to get, I think, less demanding in terms of infrastructure, and there will be more opportunity for that co-location. We have, I think that the key difference for Tennessee and other states that was more of a challenge for us is the fact that, we are the T in TVA. And so the way our electric poles are regulated in Tennessee is different than most of the rest of the country, because the TVA has this federal jurisdiction around that. And so we had to craft our small cell law in a manner that didn't include electric poles. But that's not to say that the electric industry is not fully engaged. It's been our experience that the electric industry is very interested in this infrastructure. There are a lot of opportunities for smart management of networks that rely on this kind of infrastructure. And so as electrics become more interested in that kind of infrastructure for their own use, there's a learning curve, and folks get, I think, better able to work together on those things. The Cellular Telephone Industry Association, so the group that's made up of all of the wireless companies, has begun having some very productive conversations with TVA about how this process will work in the coming years and whether there are some opportunities for us to, through their jurisdiction, engage, in a more collaborative way with the electric infrastructure. And I think another thing that we did right when we passed the law in Tennessee was include this kind of TACIR review, because the folks at TVA have relied on the good work that TACIR has done around a lot of these infrastructure issues as they have worked with us on these questions. There are some things that are just kind of simple things that if we can do more uniformly across the state, I think will help with a lot of the kind of coordination issues that we were talking about earlier. For example, the electric power that powers these small cells in some places requires a separate electric meter. Well, they don't use very much electricity, and so we're starting to work with electric companies when we negotiate agreements with them to say, okay, can we come up with just an average for how much these things use, and rather than metering them, can we just pay you based on that, and then every now and then we can do a test and true it up. And for the most part, we've found that electric companies have been very receptive to that kind of improvement, and I think that kind of thing would help us a good deal on, easing the process for the electric companies as they work with us. The reference to subcontractors is something that I feel your pain. We at AT&T, within I think a couple of months after the law was enacted, we found ourselves in the regrettable position of having to dismiss the master contractor we were dealing with and bring on a new partner. Because they just weren't capable of doing the kind of comprehensive coordination that this requires. We feel like we're doing better on that, but one of the things that we really struggle with, particularly in Middle Tennessee, as the construction boom has kind of continued in Middle Tennessee, when you get down to the subcontractor level, a lot of those companies do all kinds of construction work, and it's hard to consistently keep somebody if another construction company gets in a bind and agrees to pay them more. Folks that you thought were working on your job have suddenly gotten the flu. So we also are having trouble with that, and we are continuing to work to try to, through our own contracting with those folks. Obviously, it's in our interest to have them do the work properly, do it on time, do it consistently with what we have designed. We're working to try to improve that process ourselves, but I think as a general matter, AT&T would be very receptive to some sort of uniform policy across the state around coordinating different utilities. Anytime there's a road project or there's, any kind of construction that impacts, digging or placing new infrastructure, it's going to impact not just the communications, but also the electric, all kinds of infrastructure. And many cities have a kind of uniform platform for all utilities to kind of communicate with one another. We don't all always have access to see that, but it would be a great thing if we could find a way across the state to bring some transparency to that so that we could better coordinate. a lot of times on road moves, for example, where the infrastructure is aerial, the communications infrastructure is the bottom. And so we're the last to get off of a pole. And so frequently we're kind of in the position of holding up a project because somebody else hasn't moved and we're not the boss of them. So, they don't have to move because we tell them to. But I think there isn't, at least in my experience, there's certainly no intention about that. It really is just a matter of each of these utilities trying to focus on, safely providing the utility service that they provide, and anything that this group might want to study about how we might better inform each other of that work, how we could in real time be able to share that information. I think that would be a cost saver to all of those entities. I think it would be a safety enhancement. I think it would also help to alert all of the utility community around some trend that's all of a sudden making it necessary to do a lot of work. Because if you're the water system, you wouldn't necessarily know that all of a sudden there's going to be a lot of small cell infrastructure coming. And so I think that kind of coordination would be something that we would certainly welcome. We also agree that there should be some kind of timetable for the completion of these projects after a permit is issued. We are wary of companies kind of getting out and getting permission to have all the good spots and then never putting up the infrastructure. So, we also have an interest in seeing that those things get completed in as timely a process as possible. Just like we've had a very good experience thus far in talking with TVA about how we can inform some of their policy decisions with our experience on small cell. We had a really good experience working with the Municipal League and the County Services Association following the enactment of this law. TML put together kind of a manual for its members about, hey, instead of just kind of having to read every line of this law, here's sort of what these applications are going to look like. Here are the various rules and timetables that you'll need to follow. And we found that incredibly helpful. And in fact, we've shared that with other states and told them it's almost easier to tell what the Tennessee law is by reading that TML work product than it is to read the law and understand it. So lots of thanks goes to those organizations, I think, for helping us do as well as we've been able to do. We certainly hit a learning curve every time we get to a new community where we haven't done many of these, but our experience thus far has been, incredibly positive. So that's what I have kind of prepared, but I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
Thank you, President Phillips. Questions? Sure. Cindy Yeager.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one question for you. Do you see the small cell technology as a feasible way to get internet into the rural areas? I know in your initial comment you had mentioned that you were looking at the areas where there were the highest traffic, and I wanted to hear what you had to say about that.
Yeah, it's the initial demand on our networks that led us to the small cell kind of innovations really were about very populated areas. Although I will say sometimes we talk about populated and we think of that as where people live, but it's also sometimes at an interstate exchange where, so it can be that rural areas actually are these congestion points, and then also they can be those congestion points intermittently. Bonnaroo is a great example of we have a permanent fiber line there now in order to hook up the temporary additional infrastructure that we use to support that kind of experience. But in general, yes, small cell technology is going to be relevant to continued broadband expansion into rural areas, and general wireless technology is as well. Fixed wireless types of internet systems are a good solution for rural areas. And a lot of the companies who make that infrastructure, the parts that we actually have to use to deploy, are in both the small cell world and the antenna world for that kind of fixed infrastructure. So there's kind of an additional benefit of the more we can deploy small cells, the more those companies, produce the parts because they know there's going to be plenty demand, and it makes it easier to, for them to justify offering new antenna that we can use in our fixed wireless solutions for more rural areas. And the other thing I would say, too, is that we are seeing a really dramatic trend away from fixed broadband to mobile broadband. More people, we're seeing kind of a new generation of cord cutting, the way people did with telephones or went from cable subscription to over the top. We're seeing a lot of people whose primary internet access is their mobile smart device. And as that happens, that makes more demand into those rural areas and further justifies the deployment, the investment in those areas of wireless. So wireless should be one of the best things ever to happen to the rural broadband question, I think.
Well, I've got Mayor McDonald next, and then I'll...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Phillips, thanks for being here. I'll give a shout out to Chuck Thomas. You tell him I said that. He always says, I'm his favorite mayor, which I know he says to all mayors. But I'll just, but I'll just say, Chuck is my favorite AT&T guy, and I say that to all the AT&T employees. But I have a question. I think you kind of answered it. The number of small cells that you have deployed in Tennessee, is that 8,000 in the first year? What?
The number that AT&T has deployed, I'd break down into a couple of categories. We currently have 150 online, that are up and running. And we have another 150 or so where we have permits and they are in active construction. Again, I can't speak to forward-looking investment, but I can tell you that I think there is general expectation across the industry that an entity of our size and footprint, would likely have another 200 up and going by the end of 2020. As a comparison point, before the law was enacted, we spent about 18 months on trying to get 4 small cells approved and deployed for downtown Nashville. We only got 1 of them done in that time. And then since that time, we've been able to get to 150 online, 150 in the gate. So the pace has dramatically improved as a result of the law.
But you are shooting for, where's the 200,000 in 7-year number come from?
Nationally, that's a national number.
Okay.
So, yeah, it won't be necessary for us to have that amount for Tennessee to do what that infrastructure does.
And one final thing is, how many of the utility boxes are necessary for per small cell towers?
I'm not sure what you mean by a utility box.
Well, you have a box that was a part of that legislation
Right.
that, required a place to be provided or to help you all find a place and for it to have access 24/7. That box has something to do with the small cell, but I'm wondering what is the ratio for those boxes to the small cells?
So the small cell itself is in a kind of a box that's about twice the size of a Quaker Oats
Right.
container. There's 1 of those per small cell.
Right.
There is a much smaller box that is kind of the power shut off and 1-to-1 again. Well, that's actually one per pole. If we were to put two on a pole, and at this point, I don't know why one provider would do that. But the pole itself needs an emergency shut-off, and that, one per pole. And then often there is an electric meter required if the electric entity requires that, and that again would be one per small cell. So if someone co-located, that would require two. But as I said, I feel like we are trending away from the need to necessarily meter. These things draw very little power. So I think we ought to be able to get to a formula for how you pay per small cell instead of per usage.
Okay, there is some kind of a box that is behind gates in Bartlett that says property of AT&T, and I thought they related to the small cell, so I'll have to dig into that a little bit more.
I'll follow up on that as well, too. There certainly are boxes that we use with regard to our fiber delivery of internet access and with regard to the backhaul that's related to small cells. So it could be that that's a box related to fiber that is serving the small cells but is not necessarily directly, a direct formula to correlate those. But I will follow up and find out what those boxes are in Bartlett.
Thank you.
All right. Next, I had Mayor Brooks and then Mayor Huffman. Mayor Brooks?
Thank you, Chairman. I'm enjoying continuing the period of discovery serving here on TACIR and learning these things. I'm thankful to Mayor Huffman bringing up the easement and the testimony today of the lack of uniformity of the general easement ordinances, and I look forward to sort of digging into that. I am the proud owner of a new home, the first home in a subdivision, and we've now had multicolored paint 5 times through our yard with no prior warning of any kind. And so that it continues to be an interesting discussion. I'm also interested in the discussion, the testimony of Mr. Hogue that mentioned the amounts of permits per region, and Chairman Carter and I are proud to represent the Region 2 area, which by your testimony, Mr. Hogue, was the least number of permits applied for. And I would love to take this opportunity to encourage, as we continue the deployment conversations, that we are the largest and fastest growing in manufacturing and commercial in the state. But yet it seems to be that we're the smallest in the amounts of permits for folks wanting to come our way. So thank you for being here today. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Mayor Brooks,
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to
President Brooks.
add that I do want to clarify that I think what Mr. Hogue was referring to were the TDOT permits as opposed to the other permits that we would have filed with individual municipalities or counties. And one thing that I think will drive up the TDOT applications will be these 5G-related smart transit kinds of solutions. And many of those are the kind that rather than requiring a large additional infrastructure where they already have some kind of infrastructure, we may be able to add some kind of SIM card. And I anticipate that's going to be the sort of first place that will get the most done in partnership with TDOT. And again, the 10 Smart entity, Tennessee is kind of way ahead of the curve in looking at the value of these things as compared to our sister states, and TDOT's a big part of that.
Thank you, Madam President. Mr. Chairman, if I could just, and thank you for that. Although we don't have Bonnaroo, we are the capital of the International Bacon Festival. And you're welcome to join us. Thank you, Madam President.
Mayor Huffman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your presentation. It's interesting information. Ms. Phillips, I had a couple of questions. One, if you looked 5 years down the road and you looked at Tennessee and you compare this technology and where it'll be in place, where we'll be standing relative to the other states around us in the southeastern portion of the country, where do you think Tennessee will be? That's the first question, relative to these other folks. The second question is this. This kind of technology is going to make industry more efficient, and the biggest industry in Tennessee is agriculture, not manufacturing. the rural areas in Tennessee, they'll end up with this eventually, but is this going to be a case where rural Tennessee eventually will catch up? Because the impact this kind of technology has on agriculture, and the first thing that pops into my mind is driverless tractors. The potential of making agriculture much more efficient with this technology is there, but if rural areas have to wait as long as they usually have to wait to get it to impact the largest industry in Tennessee, it looks like we ought to be doing better than that. So the two questions I have are, how soon would this technology be available for either a manufacturing industry that's interested in coming to a rural area or for agriculture purposes in rural Tennessee?
You know, I would say certainly any significant manufacturing entity, wherever it locates, by the time it's up and running, it's going to be in its own right a little dense area that would be a very attractive place to get that kind of any kind of communications technology to support it. So, but your question about agriculture, I think is another one of the good stories in kind of thinking about what's going to move broadband deployment in rural areas. As companies like John Deere and Cub Cadet, you know, all of those entities are building equipment that has its own internet hotspot built in. So there are more applications now. There are more things that you can do with that. That drives more deployment of not just small cell technology, but just general broadband infrastructure. And in addition to autonomous vehicles, the other thing that I think we're seeing a lot of development around in the agriculture world are irrigation equipment that pulls up soil sample and is able in real time to send a signal to tell the cloud, you know, this is what is needed here. We need this much more water here. We need this much, you know, this change in the chemical composition of whatever soil or medium we're in. Those things are already being manufactured by the, you know, equipment companies. That drives a lot more of the infrastructure to go there because, you know, as what makes the business case for putting more and more infrastructure into rural areas is that there are things like that using the technology. AT&T does a ton of work in the sort of connected vehicle space. Like when you get a car that, you know, Audi Connect, for example, is AT&T. You know, they brand it with their kind of brand, but we are working with them on all the applications that you can use through those kinds of vehicles. And the more of that occurs in the farm equipment space, you know, the more it will accelerate. As to where we'll be compared to other states, particularly in the Southeast, you know, I'm constantly, you know, envious of capital infrastructure budgets from Georgia because of Atlanta, Florida because of, you know, large population areas. But we got out ahead of them on this, and so our head start is going to serve us incredibly well. You know, that's being said, there's a ton of pressure in those states to catch up, and they'll, you know, do all kinds of things to kind of try to do that. They do have the advantage of being able in one place in their legislature to regulate both the electric infrastructure and the communications infrastructure, which we lack here. So there's a real need to continue the close coordination with TVA to be sure that the whole Tennessee Valley doesn't get kind of left behind because we're sort of outside of the investor electric world. But I think we're really in very good shape. And again, TDOT is a big part of that as well. TDOT was one of the first state departments that was really talking about, you know, autonomous vehicles when other people were kind of giggling about that, like it wasn't, you know, real, and thinking about, you know, preserving right-of-way so that there would be room to put this infrastructure in place. And That's a culture shift that hasn't really occurred in every state, and that is also going to keep us ahead of the curve if we continue to have that kind of mindset.
If you're talking to a prospective industry coming into your area, they ask you if you have this because Community B in North Mississippi does have it. If we don't have it, we're not competitive anymore. Number one. Number two, many times now, manufacturing industries will require redundant fiber to their site. They depend on it so heavily that they want redundant fiber. Is redundancy, is that something that's going to be possible in the future with this kind of technology, just like fiber?
You know, the redundancy is generally not about capacity, but about in the event of a cut. And wireless infrastructure gets disrupted in different ways. So if you have 2 cell towers and you get a hurricane, that redundancy isn't necessarily meaningful. So it's more likely the case that in a wireless setting, the kind of redundancy folks are going to want is, I want a wireless cloud-based solution, and I also want to have my own server. But they certainly are looking at that kind of redundancy. I can tell you that for the most part, you know, AT&T obviously serves a lot of large corporate campuses with infrastructure. And it has always been my experience that when a prospective business is looking at an area, they go to their current provider to say, how long can you give me what I need in that place? And, you know, we are highly motivated to say, by the time you're up and running, we'll be up and running. It's rarely, I think, if ever, an industry that's waiting on that. The real broadband infrastructure, you know, difficulty is around residential, you know, individual personal broadband. And again, wireless is an easier way in. You know, everybody has kind of learned to be connected to a smartphone, and because they use it more, that creates more demand for more infrastructure. And so we're certainly seeing more of that in rural areas.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman, could I, excuse me, I'm
yes,
sorry.
sir.
Could I add on to what Joelle said in response to that question briefly?
Sure, absolutely,
I
Mr.
have
Gert.
something to add. I have the opportunity to help instruct economic and workforce development professionals over the last 7 years in conjunction with the International Economic Development Council. It gives me the opportunity to travel around the country twice a year and meet with those types of professionals of the challenges they're facing, many of which are in rural America. The questions you've raised about the deployment of wireless broadband technology in the rural areas is huge. Because, and I wouldn't look at it solely from helping site-based manufacturers or businesses in those rural communities and the citizens. I would also ask you to consider how we can improve that deployment quicker, because with the low workforce that we're experiencing, not only here in Middle Tennessee, but other places of the country, and with this type of technology, people in those rural communities can work for businesses where their home base is in a metropolitan area. And that is becoming a larger trend. And what I see from where I sit and the work I do is that the providers of this technology, granted, need to add capacity where capacity is needed, as Joelle mentioned, in highly populated area where the density is great. But it's also a return on their investment to do that. If there's some way that federal government, state government can have a requirement to push it more to the rural areas, they're the ones in the position that can do that. But to leave it by chance, whether it's in Tennessee or any other state, is not going to be able to serve those people in which those fixed-base manufacturing businesses no longer exist or are struggling to compete globally. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. Senator Yarborough, I have you on the list.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, Ms. Phillips, I was sort of struck by what you said about the fact that there are infrastructure needs at an interstate exchange, which I don't think is I think a lot of times when we think about broadband, we do think about how do we get to everyone's home, but there's a lot that really depends on where people are moving during the day. And I wonder, are there ways, or, what guidance should we be giving communities about, what are the possibilities in terms of where density happens, even in rural places, that might create different kind of economic development or infrastructure opportunities than the way that we've thought about it typically? Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and it's a great thing to be thinking about. What are all the various things we can do to drive the infrastructure that we're going to need, both based on kind of incentives to those who deploy it, but also to create the demand for it. I think one thing that communities can do is to support the adoption of broadband, not necessarily even the subscription, but utilization of more online kinds of things, in helping small cities or counties in distressed kind of areas to move more things online, to help people kind of get used to registering, getting their driver's license renewed, doing things online. And if that means, doing it on their mobile device, that means that when you design those platforms, they need to be navigable from a smart device rather than thinking about them in terms of how they look at a desktop. So that's one area that we really see a need around. But also thinking about, you hear so much about how online activity makes us kind of isolated and lonely in the world. Our libraries are a really great resource for the idea of, encouraging people to utilize the bandwidth that is, particularly at libraries, which are E-rate supported so that their connectivity is deeply discounted by the federal E-rate program. Sometimes I hear stories that, are awful about people having to drive their kids to the McDonald's parking lot to do homework. Although I have heard some great stories about how, a friend of mine said that their child who really struggled with algebra was fortunate that he met another kid at McDonald's who's really good at algebra. Right. So, there is some value in encouraging people to go to the same place to use internet access. We see when we're helping older users to be more comfortable with technology, that they adopt more quickly if they learn in an environment where there are a lot of people together. So, all of those kinds of community centers and libraries, I think all of our TCATs and community colleges, that's a great resource that's all over the state. They have the connectivity anyway for what they're doing in the schools, and I think it would be great if we were encouraging people to visit those campuses for their sort of digital literacy so that they remembered that resource is there for all of their additional education needs. Because, it's, as much as we focus on broadband infrastructure as a driver of economic development, every time we talk to an entity about what drives their choice, it is primarily about the post-secondary certification of the population in that area. So trying to think about broadband policy in a way that is complementary of the other things that we're doing, I think is important. Libraries would be kind of my first stop on how to do some of that.
All right. Anyone else? Oh, Mayor, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Mayor Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would one of you address, and I'm a fairly new person here, so you may have done it some other way, the security side of 5G?
I guess the first thing I'll say is that almost every type of technology we have to support security works better with more bandwidth. So as a general rule, the more bandwidth, the better we're going to be able to protect all of the systems that rely on connectivity. Other than that, I would say that, you know, the issues we see with cybersecurity today as applied to current technology are going to be equally relevant as to 5G. There are some places where we have recognized the need, the security needs are so important that we need to have a unique network or a unique type of connectivity. Like after the 9/11 Commission studied, you know, how we could be better prepared, one of the recommendations that came out of that was the FirstNet network, which the federal government created. AT&T was chosen as the vendor for that across the country. And it is a wireless network that enables something that was missing on 9/11, which is interoperable connections between police and fire and the ability to put that traffic ahead of other traffic so that in a real emergency, we can prioritize the emergency sort of response. I think we may find as we move forward that that same need exists for other kinds of systems. I think, you know, TVA is doing a lot of work around the importance of cybersecurity around the electric grid and electric infrastructure. All of those things will work better when they can rely on the additional bandwidth that, you know, additional 5G kind of technology will provide.
Other questions, follow-up? Or any other question? Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Chairman, is there any way that we can get a list of all the locations of where 5G has been deployed and possibly also broadband?
Wow, I have no idea. Who, the lady that was here last time from the state? Would she?
She's in charge of broadband. She has grant information. I don't know if she has
Yeah.
location.
Yeah, I don't know. Do any of our panel members or President Phillips, would you know what
Yeah,
those-
I can speak to some of that. Almost all of the 5G deployment, right now there are places where 5G evolution technology or limited location 5G technology is available from various wireless carriers. Most of those things get reported because we're all so proud of it, you know. And so I think we probably could, with the Cellular Telephone Industry Association, pull together at least what has been publicly announced. In addition, broadband mapping is, you know, kind of a hot topic right now. We have, in Tennessee, we kind of based our most recent broadband policy around the way the FCC had identified the availability of broadband for purposes of their broadband support program, the Connect America Fund. What the FCC is looking at now is better broadband mapping, because I think we all recognize there are places where that mapping shows broadband availability where, you know, yeah, it's available to one person in that census block, but maybe not at the same bandwidth as another, and it skews the map. But there are some better ways of gathering information that the FCC has access to that would allow for better broadband mapping. And they're in the process right now of the comment, you know, period on that. And I think as right now what's available is what USAC, which is a part of the Department of Commerce, does a map. That's probably the best, and that's what the FCC's CAF program is driven off of. But there's about to be something a little bit better, and it will be especially relevant. The places where broadband mapping is least reliable, it's exactly the places we're all concerned about. It's rural areas, and particularly states with rural areas where the topography is different. So that's exactly Tennessee, right? We have, sandy delta, mountainous, we have all kinds of geography where we have rural areas. That's not as true in other states. And so a lot of the way broadband mapping got developed just isn't quite as good at that. But I think we've got some better stuff on the horizon. But we can certainly work with Dr. Owen to make sure that TACIR has as much as we know of it is available in terms of mapping.
All right. Other questions or comments? Mary, you have anything else? All right, thank you. Anyone else? Oh, Mr. Peach, go ahead.
Mike's not on.
Yeah. Mr. Peach, you mind turn your mic on so we'll have a good record?
I think I hit it twice. Speaking with one of your competitors, I know that when the small cell legislation came through and FCC's changes and all this, a lot of the folks are asking, and I still hear a lot of folks asking about rural connectivity. But is it not true that really the answer for rural connectivity is not small cell, that that's really designed for urban, and there needs to be another, something in the future that would probably cast a wider net for those rural?
It's definitely true that the primary application for rural areas using wireless technology is fixed wireless systems where rather than small cells on one tower smaller than a cell tower but bigger than a small cell tower, antenna are placed, all around to create a circle, and using that wireless antenna infrastructure, we can deliver over a wireless connection bandwidths that are comparable to what you get from a fiber connection. Those are a very good source for rural areas. Small cell technology, again, initially is really about this density thing, but as we get ready to make a ubiquitous 5G network that just blankets the country, small cells are going to be necessary even in places that we think of today as rural, both because, rural areas are still close to an interstate. And if we want autonomous vehicles to work on that interstate, we're going to have the infrastructure that delivers that kind of 5G, and that's going to include small cells. New innovations in the way other kinds of equipment operates that are more relevant to rural areas, I think you'll see there will be an application for small cells, but you're right that the initial need for them was this capacity boost that happens in areas where people congregate, whether that means that they live near each other or that they gather, for the Bristol Motor Speedway, that creates a big traffic drain. And that's true of almost any kind of venue. And there are, more of those in more rural areas than people might imagine.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments?
Representative, there was one other thing that Mayor Brooks mentioned that I did want to come back to about the marking of, because I agree that thing about painting, as people are constructing stuff is something that we hear about in Nashville all the time because there's so much construction going on. That is part of the call before you dig kind of framework in the state. And if we were going to build some kind of platform where utilities could better communicate with each other, that was kind of the same idea, was to get all the utilities to say, hey, don't dig here because that's where my stuff is. That wouldn't be a bad place to start, to think about all the same entities who are concerned about their stuff getting cut are the very folks who need to be part of the conversation to speed the coordination and collaboration around this kind of infrastructure stuff. So I'm sorry that it's an annoyance, but it's a good idea. And I'm glad you mentioned it because I think it's actually a of all of the places in state law that might, be susceptible to addressing this problem, that call before you dig framework might be just the ticket.
All right, other questions or comments? I have a couple, if you would indulge me, to each of you, or primarily to President Phillips. The governor's decision to relocate refugees lit my phone and my mailbox up. I've been trying to keep up with that, and yesterday was a bit surprised to understand that the call count and the emails this week was more about rural broadband than refugees. Mayor Brooks and I share a district that's one of the most unserved. I have a very dense area that will have 5G, and then I have these beautiful farms and developments that just have dial-up, and so it's extremely frustrating. I know you're aware of that, and so I just wanted to say that people are extremely frustrated about that. We've met frequently with Volunteer Energy. It's very difficult to ask them to go and make an infrastructure investment that may never pay off. That's not wise. It's very hard for people to understand that. So I'm in hopes that maybe 5G in some way will help that, or some kind of wireless, because that's obviously the way to cover the biggest or the largest areas. To go back about 35 years, I worked my way through college and law school putting conduit in the ground for Bell South. On Murfreesboro Road, we put in what we call 144-way conduit, which means 144 4-inch pipes in the ground, encased in concrete, so no one could cut them. And then we would pull a 3-inch copper wire in there, and I think we call it 256 pair. I'm too old for you to know much of this. But that is still in the ground somewhere, because the way we put it in there, no one's ever going to take it out. Are those conduit? I mean, we went out on, I worked all one summer on Granny White Pike, accidentally blew up a country music star's car by mistake. Who would have known dynamite would have done that? So I had quite a bit of experience in Nashville on my way to law school. But we put 12-way all the way out Granny White Pike when I guess every home probably had 10 or 12 acre average. It was certainly not densely populated. Are those used now, or could those, I mean, they're at full capacity. There's no way for you or others to run 5G cables through those and not have to dig up the roads and argue about right-of-ways and things?
Well, yes is the short answer, that kind of infrastructure can be and is being used to support all of the kinds of connectivity that we provide today. Any place where we could pull through copper wire, and sometime since then we have pulled through fiber. Mm-hmm. And in some places there are reasons why it is more or less effective, because of the kind of electronics that have to be attached to fiber being different than the kind that we used with copper pair. Although I will tell you that AT&T Labs last year was able to run 2 gigs over a mile of plain old copper pair.
I've read that study.
I know, it was great. So some of that plant, may ultimately, get utilized in a way that, we don't pull things out of the ground that can still be used, unless there's something else coming in. And I bet a lot of what you worked on, TDOT is enjoying right now as the road widening project along Franklin Road, and there's a lot of infrastructure there because those big corridors that just like any other kind of, the same places you find car traffic, you find infrastructure traffic, because we used those same kind of major thoroughfares to do the big fiber install. And it is important to remember, Wireless networks require fiber. There has to be fiber backhaul, back from the tower. So that stuff is all supporting the current stuff. I am hopeful that some of the newest technology around fiber itself will enable us to share conduit more easily, will enable us to direct bury without conduit, will allow us to bury at different depths, will allow us to repair more easily so that we don't have to worry quite as much about it getting cut. So there are a bunch of things happening now that I think will make us get a better return or a continued return on a lot of that investment. And then the other thing I would say, too, to keep in mind about rural areas is that the General Assembly's broadband law that passed about 3 years ago, I guess, that enabled the electric cooperatives to get into the business of offering broadband. I think that is going to continue to be more and more relevant because of a bunch of changes in consumer behavior. I think one of the things that made that, that volunteers having to think about the business case, one of the things that used to really be, something to think twice about as a small network was you wanted to rely on TV as a way to bundle and make the business case. But the only way you could get that content was through these aggregators. And if you were a small entity like that, there are only a few aggregators that would do business with you, and they were very expensive. As people have moved to Netflix and Hulu and over-the-top kind of video, we've had a lot of great conversations with electric co-ops who are in the process of getting into the broadband world about partnering with us to be their content provider. And so we'd provide AT&T TV over their broadband connection, and then they wouldn't have to include the additional cost. So there are going to be things that continue to change that may make the business case change for those rural areas, and I think that's worth keeping an eye on, too.
Well, as one of my friends I've come to know during this battle said it most succinctly, all we want is the highest quality, fastest internet available. We only want it yesterday, and we only want it cheap. So if that will help you, give some, you may hear that every day. Anyway, I thought at least I appreciated him being honest with me, but we're still out there and we're still looking. He, by the way, moved from Marietta, bought a beautiful farm and restored an antebellum home. His business is internet, and he now has an office down in Ottawa, and he drives down twice a day and plugs his computer in and does it and then drives back. And trust me, every time I see him, I hear that, and I feel his pain. I think everyone in the rural areas feel the same way. But we know it's not happened overnight, but we sure hope we're on the radar, and we hope it's moving as fast as possible. Other questions or comments? Well, enlightening, and thank you so much for each one and all the time you spent on this. Now, we do have other people available. If you have questions for the Rural Electric Association, trying to pull that out of my head. Who else do we have here? Tennessee County Service Association, Tennessee Electrical Cooperative, Tennessee Municipal Electric Power Association. If anyone has any question for them, we have a representative of each of them here, not on the panel, but willing to answer questions if anyone does. No questions? This is a great service to the state you performed, and we thank you. And thank you for an excellent presentation. All right, what's next? All right, let's move to tab 9, House Bill 971, Senate Bill 1075, Local Revenue and Services. This is an interim report under tab 9.
Thank you, Chairman, Commissioners.
You ready, Michael?
Yeah.
No.
My name is Michael Mount, and I'll be presenting our report on K-12 funding and services. This is a second interim report. Our first interim report was on the internet sales tax, and that was approved in January of 2019. The second interim report can be found behind tab 9, and this report is for your review, comment, and approval. The executive summary of this report was presented at the December meeting, and the recommendation remains unchanged. That recommendation is for a comprehensive review of the components to be made either by the BEP Review Committee or other designated state or local officials and other stakeholders to ensure that the BEP funding formula supports a commonly accepted basic level of education for Tennessee students. Since the December meeting, we've added the analysis section of the report, which follows the executive summary. We've added information about the system level fiscal capacity model and a reference to our other report on the effects of sharing revenue among school systems and counties with more than one school system. That is on page 3. On page 13, we've added a figure showing the state share and local match of school systems. We've updated data on the number of licensed instructional positions generated by BEP formula and the number of actually employed by school systems, which includes the number that are federally funded. And that's table 2 and can be found on page 18. Finally, we break down the expenditures as a percentage of total expenditures by county and city school system, and those are appendixes A and B starting on page 29. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Questions? Mayor McDonald.
Yeah, it's probably more of a statement than a question, but the recommendation I continue to support. Some parts of the analysis I still question, and I mentioned this to Michael and Melissa yesterday, where the addition of the language, in my opinion, somewhat promoting the idea that we go from counties to systems as a way to do funding. That still troubles me, but I do agree with the recommendation, and it stayed the same, so I'm still good with that. Yes, sir.
And I just want to point out, and it does say this in the report as well as the other report where we refer to the system level model, we do make clear that we've included information, updated information on the system level model that we prepared with the Comptroller's Office back in 2005, but it's included only for illustrative purposes, and if the state were to actually enact a recommendation like that, which is not the recommendation in the study, but it's referred to, that it would be, it could be any. The model would not have to be the model that we prepared back in 2005. There are various ways that it could be accomplished.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lippert. Any other questions or comments for Dr. Mount? Mayor Anderson.
Thank you. On the data that you presented in Appendix X on Appendix A on page 29 through 32, through those years that you've got listed for the percentage of total county expenditures, does that pick up bond indebtedness also, or is that just capital investments and operational?
I believe the answer to that, and I'll verify this, it's the current proportion for that year, and it would include the total expenditure on those things. The percentage is the numerator, and that percentage is the education-related expenditure, and then that the denominator is the total expenditure of the county. And to be more specific, we utilize the comprehensive annual financial reports, and that the information that we pull can be found in the statement of activities in those reports. So I can show you exactly which numbers I used, if that would help.
And as a follow-up, Mr. Brooks, if I could, so if you look at just Williamson County on page 31 and the year 17, 18, I would have to question your answer to that. You're saying that 78.2% of the funding goes to public education?
Of expenditures.
Of expenditures.
Yeah, and,
You're saying there's only 22% left for everything else. That's another way I would ask you.
the way it was calculated, the total expenditures of the school system in the county, in this case Williamson County Schools, is added to the total expenditures of the county. And that's the total. And then the 78.2% is the school system's percentage of that total. So I hope that makes sense. So that they are being combined to create the total.
Thank you, Mayor Anderson. Any other questions or comments or follow-up for Mr. Mount? Mayor Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Michael, let me ask you, the local money, the $4.1 billion local money spent, I think a total in 17-18 was $10.2 billion. That $4.1 billion, though, that excludes money that's used for education from debt instruments. For example, if Williamson County issued $100 million worth of school bonds, that $100 million is not in that $4.1 billion, is it?
The 4.1 is current revenue, so I think that's right. We'd have to check.
Would that, I guess my question is, would the $4.1 billion include any bond issues that counties would issue or cities would issue or special school districts would issue during the 17-18 fiscal year?
No, I think it excludes bond proceeds.
So it's bond proceeds are exempt.
They're just excluded from that number. Yeah.
So that's a big number. I mean, that's somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion, is it not?
There's a category called other non-revenue receipts that the Department of Education collects. I believe it was about $700 million for the state.
So that $700 million is coming from local governments that's not in the $4.1 billion.
It includes bond revenues, but it's also other things like insurance payouts and everything that's not considered revenue.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Huffman. Any other follow-up comments or questions? I'm being asked by Director Lippard that the commission will need to approve this interim report. We have a motion for approval? We have a motion. Do we have a second?
I will second based on the recommendation, not necessarily the analysis, but I concur with the recommendation.
All right, so we have a motion and a second. I appreciate that. All in favor of approval of the interim report, say aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The interim report has been approved. Thank you, Mr. Mount, for your presentation today. That takes us to tab number 10. The annual report on Tennessee public infrastructure. And Ms. Chandri. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commission members. My name is Rabia Chaudhry, and I am accompanied by my colleague Dave Kaiser. Today, I will present a brief overview of the Public Infrastructure Needs Inventory. A hard copy of the report is available for your approval under tab 10. This year's report is consistent with previous year's reports and also follows the same format. However, this year, the report is based on a 5-year period from July 2018 to June 2023. I only want to draw your attention towards a few points of interest in this year's reports. First, I would like to call your attention to Figure 1 on page 9 and Table 1 on page 10. This year, the total estimated cost per capita of all needed public infrastructure improvements in Tennessee increased for the 4th straight year. Upon Chairman Watson's recommendation, we also adjusted for inflation and found that even inflation-adjusted needs continuously increased. In this year's inventory, state and local officials reported a total need of $54.8 billion, which is about $4.8 billion more than last year. Second, I would like to call your attention to Table 2 on page 13. Because of the July 1st cutoff for the report, last year's report did not include all of the Improve Act projects. This year's report does for the most part. The Improve Act has a total of 966 projects worth $10.6 billion, of which only 189 projects worth $5.6 billion were in the last year's inventory. By contrast, this year's inventory has 925 of those projects worth $10.8 billion. Moving on, I would like to highlight why education needs have increased. Education needs are higher because of the increases in the need for infrastructure improvements on college campuses, K-12 school renovations, and the rising cost of construction materials. The need for post-secondary education infrastructure has increased by $395 million since last year, and the need for K-12 infrastructure has increased by $242 million. Moreover, increases in the infrastructure needs in the health, safety, and welfare category is mostly because of the increase in the need for public health facilities, upgrade to water and wastewater infrastructure, and the need for fire protection infrastructure. The estimated cost of public health facilities has increased by $148 million. The estimated cost of water and wastewater facilities has increased by $103 million, and the cost of fire protection facilities has increased by $58 million. The need for projects that support recreation and cultural assets continue to increase. This year, the estimated cost of recreational projects has increased by $121 million, and the estimated cost of community development projects has increased by $57 million, and the estimated cost of libraries, museums, and historic site projects has increased by $29 million. The final point of interest I want to highlight is that, as in the previous years, nearly two-thirds of the needs in this year's inventory are not funded. However, as the projects move forward from conceptual stage to the planning and design stages, more funding will become available for them. This was all a brief overview of the needs reported in the current inventory report. If you want to see how your county is performing, please look at Appendix D and Appendix E at the back of tab 10. Appendix D contains information on projects types and development stage, and Appendix E contains information related to school districts. The county summaries start on page 21. Lastly, I would like to update you on the current status of the inventory for the next year. The July 2019 inventory is currently being surveyed by the development districts. We would like to thank the development districts for all their hard work in collecting this information. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions, Dave and I are happy to answer them before we seek approval of the July 2018 infrastructure report.
Thank you, Ms. Chaudhry, for that great amount of information. I'm especially pleased with the one-page Bradley County presentation. That's a very helpful tool for those of us who are in municipal and county governments back home. So thank you for that in our information. Are there any comments or questions? Yes, sir. Mayor Waters.
Thank you. Just one question, and this is a valuable report, and I understand that. The information that has been gathered and is in the report, is it coming from consistent sources in every county? In other words, the school estimation in Sevier County, does that come from the director of schools the same way in Tipton County or other counties? The roads, I expect, comes from Public Works and highway superintendents, but is it consistent across the state as far as who is giving this information and the criteria that they're given to put in their infrastructure needs? And I guess where I'm going is one county, the folks say, well, this is what, right here is what we've determined in our planning for the county or in the cities that absolutely has to happen in the next 5 years, and we've got to figure out a way to fund it. Or in another county, are they saying, well, we'd like to have this. It's not necessary, but we certainly think would like to have it. Is there consistent criteria across the state given to these entities, and is it the same people in each county and area giving the information?
Thank you for that question. Yes, the information collected for this report is coming from consistent sources. We have contracts with the development district, which are serving on our behalf and providing us with the information. And I think Dave can provide you a better answer for this.
Yeah, every year. Hello, can you hear me? I am Dave Kaiser with TACIR. Yes, we contract with the 9 development districts, and every year we have the development districts update their contacts. These are the people that they survey at the local level. We do that because there are some political turnover at the local level, but for the most part, they're very consistent across the broad spectrum of local agencies. I could speak for TDOT. When we get the information from TDOT, we get that directly from TDOT every year from the same source, and we update that into our database.
Thank you, Mayor Waters. Mayor McDonald, do you recognize?
The page 214, table D-22A. I noticed there, and in the next page, 2-page, does not include Shelby County. And I noticed that in different places where certain counties were not included. And then I noticed on page 256 in table E-9, it breaks out the municipalities in Shelby County with the exception of Memphis. And I know just in what we've had to go throughout Shelby County on the ADA mandates for our public facilities, they have a huge number, and I just don't understand why they're not here.
I think I can address this question. First, on page 256, this table here is all about school infrastructure needs. Mm-hmm. And in that case, the reason why Memphis is not listed there is because of the Shelby County school system. Okay. On page 214 for industrial sites and parks, I have no explanation for why Shelby hasn't reported any needs for industrial sites. I will have to speak with the local development district about that.
Well, follow-up. You said that the 256 had to do with school systems. It says by type of mandate and school system, so that's, you just broken down each of the systems by those items?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, all of Appendix C is about school needs.
What about, could you direct me to the table regarding the ADA mandates for all the counties and cities not in school system, not school system related?
We do not have a table for that, but we can look into that for you.
Because I think, again, since you pointed that out to me, that's just our schools. That doesn't count all of our other buildings, and all of the cities now with this real pressure point on ADA. I just didn't see an accounting for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor McDonald. Mayor Huffman, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I move approval of the report.
Thank you. We have a motion for approval of this final report. Do we have a second? We have a second from Mr. Peach. I'm grateful for that. Any follow-up comments or questions before we take the vote? All in favor of passage for approval, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. The ayes have it. It is vote by the commission for the approval. Go ahead, Dr. Lippert.
And as our presenters leave the table, I would add also that this is Rabia's birthday today, so if everyone could wish her a happy birthday.
Happy birthday. Next, if the commission will turn to tab 11, we will hear from Dr. Matthew Owen, who is reporting on the Tennessee Valley Authority pilot payment in lieu of taxes. It is the annual report presented to us for approval. Dr. Owen, welcome back.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, members. Again, I am Matt Owen, and I will be presenting the Commission's annual report on the Tennessee Valley Authority's payments in lieu of taxes for your approval. And again, this is behind tab 11 in your docket books, as well as the associated memo. This report, consistent with past year's reports, does not recommend any legislative actions beyond continuing to monitor annual changes in TVA's pilot. And because the report also follows the same general format as last year, I'm going to focus my presentation on 3 points of interest within the updated information. So first, I would direct your attention to Table 1, which is located on page 4 of the report. And Table 1 shows the estimated pilot for federal fiscal year 2019-20, as well as the actual payments for the previous 5 federal fiscal years. As we describe in the report, TVA's pilot is equal to 5% of its gross revenue from power sales, excluding sales to federal entities. And it's divided among the states based both on the value of TVA power property in each state and on revenue from power sales in each state. You'll notice that this is the 3rd straight year that the pilot and both the overall pilot and payments to Tennessee have increased, though this year's increase is less than last year's increase. And if you're interested in what these increases look like on a state fiscal year basis, I would direct your attention to the 2nd paragraph on page 5. One last thing to note about that table, you'll see that the percentage of the pilot that Tennessee receives, this is the 2nd line of the table, the percentage that Tennessee receives is increasing, and although this year the increase is relatively slight, about half a percentage point, changes in that percentage do bear watching because they can have a significant effect on the amount of money that Tennessee receives from TVA. And this is actually this year is a good example of that. So the overall pilot increased for all states by approximately $4 million. And so you would anticipate that payments to Tennessee would increase by some smaller subset of that $4 million overall increase. But in fact, payments to Tennessee this year are estimated to increase by more than $5.5 million. And that is as a direct result of the increase in the percentage that Tennessee is receiving this year. So looking forward, TVA has announced that it will retire the lone coal-fired unit at its Bull Run plant in Anderson County, Tennessee. And as a result of that, all else remaining equal, the value of TVA power property in Tennessee will decrease. And so therefore, in the future, the percentage of the pilot that Tennessee receives could also decrease as well. The second point of interest that I want to draw your attention to is the new long-term wholesale power contract option that TVA made available to distributors, and this is discussed on pages 13 and 14 in the report. In particular, these new long-term contracts include rebates for distributors for a portion of the power that they purchase from TVA. And because TVA will credit these rebates prior to calculating its gross revenue from power sales, these rebates will have an effect on both the overall pilot and on the payments that Tennessee receives. It's been reported that if all of the distributors were to opt in to these contracts, that TVA's gross revenue would decrease by up to $225 million. And so if you run the numbers on what that looks like for the pilot, that would result in around $11 million decrease for the overall pilot and approximately a $7.5 million decrease for payments to Tennessee. As of the close of the last federal fiscal year, approximately 100, or actually I think it was exactly 131 of the 154 distributors had opted into these new contracts. And so staff will continue to monitor the rebates and their effect on the pilot for next year's report. The final thing that I would like to draw your attention to in the report is the potential for changes in TVA's customer base, and that is covered on pages 14 through 16 in the report. The reason that we've added this information to the report this year is because one of TVA's Tennessee distributors, Memphis Light Gas and Water, is currently studying whether to leave the TVA system. And if a distributor like MLGW were to leave the TVA system, the effect that that would have on the revenue that's distributed through the state's TVA pilot distribution formula would depend in large part on the cost of wholesale power that the exiting distributor ends up purchasing from entities other than TVA. And this is because under Public Chapter 1035, Acts of 2010, these wholesale power purchases would be subject to payments in lieu of taxes that are equivalent to those made by TVA, and as a result, they would at least partially offset any decreases in the amount that Tennessee receives from TVA based on that distributor leaving. So one more concern there for local governments. For local governments that are located in a service area of a distributor that leaves, so for local governments whose distributor ends up exiting the TVA system, they would see their allocations through the state formula decrease significantly, and in some circumstances they could see those allocations eliminated entirely. And that is because under state law, those communities in an area where a distributor leaves the TVA system would be excluded from the portions of the state formula that allocate revenue based on population, county acreage, and TVA acreage. So in terms of MLGW and its ongoing study, it's my understanding that the consultants who are performing that study will be releasing recommendations related to it in March of this year, and staff plan to provide the Commission with an update of the study and its recommendations at the May Commission meeting. Now, regardless of what MLGW decides, their current contract with TVA does include a 5-year termination notice requirement, so this would give the state and local governments time to make any adjustments necessary were MLGW to decide to leave. That concludes my presentation. As in years past, there is, of course, no guarantee that TVA's pilot will increase or remain the same from year to year, and that is something for governments to consider when incorporating TVA pilot revenue into their budgeting and planning processes. I want to thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions before seeking approval of the report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if you will explain the effect of Memphis Light Gas and Water should they decide to leave TVA again, if you don't mind.
Yes, if Memphis Light Gas and Water were to leave the TVA system, Memphis Light Gas and Water currently accounts for approximately 9% of TVA's gross revenue. So if they were to leave the system, that would reduce TVA's overall revenue, and it would also reduce the percentage of TVA's power sales that are located in Tennessee. So that would have sort of a twofold effect on the amount of the pilot, or the payments that Tennessee receives. It would reduce the overall size of the pilot, and would also reduce the share of the size, or the share of that pie that is directed to Tennessee. So that would reduce the amount of money that's flowing through the state formula from TVA. Now, as I mentioned, Public Chapter 1035 Acts of 2010 does carry a provision where any wholesale power purchases located within the Tennessee Valley's authorities, what would have been its prior service area, are subject to payments in lieu of tax that would be equivalent to those made by TVA, and there are some nuances there. So they would at least partially offset what the loss in revenue from TVA's pilot decreasing.
A follow-up on that. In what I understood you to say earlier when you were talking about MLGW, the cities, municipalities would not have a way to recover their losses. It would just be the state in the payment in lieu, or is it, I'm not clear on your point.
So, yes, and my understanding again, so those payments that we just discussed, that would be added back in to run through the state's distribution formula. The issue there is that for the local governments like the cities located in MLGW service area, they would no longer be eligible for that portion of the state formula that distributes money based on population, which is the major way that cities receive their money through the formula, and then also county acreage and TVA acreage, which would affect Shelby County in that instance as well. And so that's a function of the current state law and how the formula works is that a distributor or the communities whose distributor leaves the TVA system, I think it's after March 8th, 1990, are excluded from that portion of the formula. So it grandfathers in some of our areas that I think like, I'm losing the name of the city now, but it grandfathers in some of our areas that have never been part of the TVA system, but that does exclude those that leave going forward.
So let me make it more granular for my understanding. If we look on page 31, Appendix D, in the distribution of city shares, TVA payments in lieu of, we'll look at Bartlett's just because that obviously is what I'm most familiar with. In the last year reported, it says here we received $694,000. So would we be losing all of that if that were to go through?
So yes, in my understanding is that Bartlett would lose all of its allocation through that part of the formula if this were to happen. And so there are sort of three, maybe a way to think about this, there are three buckets within the formula. The state and all of the local governments receive a payment equal to what they received through the state formula as it existed in the 1977-78 fiscal year. So my understanding is Bartlett did not receive a payment through that part of the formula. There's a second part of the formula that allocates money to communities in areas affected by TVA construction projects. Those are commonly referred to as the impact payments. Bartlett is actually currently receiving an impact payment, but those tend to phase out over time. The major part of the formula, and where most of the money is distributed, is through the part of the formula that distributes money based on population, county acreage, and TVA acreage. And so that's what would affect Bartlett. That's where they would lose effectively all of their current allocation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
No, fine. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me make sure I understand you. So if MLG&W decides to buy power from, I don't know who the alternative is, but let's say it's Arkansas Power and Light. Does Arkansas Power and Light have to pay in lieu of payments to Tennessee, to Memphis, or to Shelby County?
So I'll preface this by saying to Memphis, to the county. So I don't know the answer to that. I would have to look that information.
In other words, if there's a decrease in TVA in lieu of payments, is there an increase in payments coming from someone other than TVA who's providing power?
So the increase that I discussed through Public Chapter 1035 Acts of 2010 goes to the state to run through the state formula. It is not directly paid to the local governments affected in that case. I would have to do more research to see if there are other avenues for those local governments to get payments from their outside distributors. I'm not aware of any at this point, but I would have to go look at that.
MLG&W is obviously a huge customer. I think 10% of TVA's revenue, which is a large number. They've also converted the Allen Steam plant in Memphis to a natural gas fired plant, and I'm not sure if TVA operates that or if they contract it out. Do you know, and do you know what effect that's got on the formula?
So my understanding is that the Allen facility is owned and operated by TVA, and so this is something that were MLGW to leave. That would not affect the ownership and operation of Allen necessarily. Now, that's obviously something that could be negotiated as part of that severance, but it could, if it remains within the TVA system, then that plant, that would not be affected necessarily. So the direct payments that Shelby County receives related to that property as a power property would remain. So Shelby County in that instance would still receive money from TVA because of that property. But that's obviously subject to negotiations and everything like that.
If there were a local government in Tennessee that was using TVA in lieu of revenue for its debt service fund to repay school bond principal and interest on debt, if you looked at it over the next 5 to 10 years and you looked at that TVA in lieu of money, how reliable do you think that would be to continue in the debt service fund?
So again, I would hesitate to provide any guidance necessarily on that. I will just say that I think those are payments that can fluctuate from year to year, and I think even by TVA's own releases, they are not anticipating load growth necessarily in the coming years, and so they're not necessarily anticipating increases in revenue at the moment. But those are things that can fluctuate from year to year, and so that's just something for local governments to consider, I think, as they decide how to use that funding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In light of what you have told us in this report, would it be a fair statement to say that because of some of these entities that are looking to leave TVA and for other issues, that it would appear that the trend in the payment in lieu of taxes over the next several years would be a downward trend in the state of Tennessee for multiple reasons? One of them is large distributors looking at buying power from somewhere else, which I assume the reason they're looking at that is because they think they can buy power cheaper from somewhere else. That would be the only factor I would think that you would have if in leaving TVA. And so did this phenomenon about looking to leave, that's fairly recent?
Yes, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, my understanding is yes, that Memphis Light Gas and Water began that study, I believe, in the spring or the summer of 2019, and so that is something that's been a recent development for them. There have been instances in the past where distributors have left the TVA system. I think most recently there were several distributors in Kentucky that left the system. There's at least one in Virginia that left and then came back several years thereafter. Historically, I think Memphis Light Gas and Water actually left the system once in the 50s and then came back in the mid-60s. So that is something that happened.
Yeah. And so but the trend would appear to be headed down for payments in lieu of taxes in the state of Tennessee because of these various factors that we've talked about, and the question about whether these other entities would have to pick up payment in lieu of taxes. We don't know. We're not 100% sure the answer of that. If a big system leaves, will they have to pay payment in lieu of taxes? Maybe to the state, but we don't know about the local portion.
That'd be a correct characterization.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
On the 29th and 30th of this month, the Association of Tennessee Valley Governments is meeting in Murfreesboro. There's going to be a section on payment in lieu of taxes. So, Matt, I know you attend quite often that, so we could bring the information back and answer the questions from that situation. I think it would be very specific with regard to what we feel local government's impact will be, especially in Tennessee.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
So I'd invite us to come back and visit that again, but I would move the report be approved.
Second. We have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Thank you.
Yeah, he's slow.
All right. I've been battling a kidney stone and stepped out there for a few minutes, and I have no good news to report, but maybe later. That's a study that we'll get into in maybe next time. Tab 12. Senate Bill 1114, Community Resilience to Natural Catastrophes. I'm just enthralled by this. I'm enchanted by it. So thank you for your time. And Tyler, do you want to introduce our panel and give us the intro?
Yes, sir. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. My name is Tyler Carpenter, and I'm happy to be back before you. As you may recall, Senate Bill 1114 by Senator Yarborough and House Bill 1120 by Representative Freeman was referred to the Commission for study and would have created a state government task force on community resilience, which is defined as the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, and more successfully adapt to natural disasters and extreme weather. The sponsors requested us to look at 4 different things. The first is to identify different natural catastrophes and extreme weather risks across the state. And this was the focus of the presentation in December. The second is to document the current status of community resilience planning in Tennessee at the state and local level, a topic that will be covered today by our panel. The third is to identify best practices for community resilience planning. And lastly, to determine the cost of action and inaction related to community resilience. And that bullet point was discussed at the last meeting as well. I want to touch on something that was discussed at the last meeting and draw your attention to the attachment behind tab 12. At the last meeting, members requested that information on what individuals can do to prepare for natural disasters be addressed. And the attachment is something that is available by TEMA, the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency. And it provides a lot of really good information. I recommend taking a look at that. And with that, I'll introduce our panel. First, we have Kent Archer, who is the Community Development Block Grant Director at the Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development. And next, we'll have Kendra Apkowitz, who is the Director of the Office of Policy and Sustainable Practices at the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. And lastly, we'll have Director Patrick Sheehan, who is the Director of the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency. And I want to thank each of them for being here today. And the Commission will receive the draft report by April for review and comment. That draft will incorporate and elaborate on the material covered in the December meeting and today's meeting as well. And with that, I'll hand it over to the panel.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you, Tyler, and thank you for having us here to discuss this topic today.
Would you introduce yourself
Yes.
for our record so we'll...
Yes, sir.
have it?
So, my name is Ken Archer. I am the Community Development Block Grant Director at the Department of Economic and Community Development. As far as disaster resilience or community resilience is concerned, our first foray into this started about 4 or 5 years ago with the National Disaster Resilience Competition through the Community Development Block Grant. It was a small, relatively small carve-out. It was $1 billion, but out of a much larger chunk of money from the Sandy disaster and earlier years. It was a competition. We were lucky enough to be one of 13 eligible, out of 67 eligible applicants. We were one of 13 that were awarded. Shelby County was also awarded. We focused our efforts on 4 counties. Initially, we had a 5th county, Tipton County, in there as well, but unfortunately, we were not funded the proposed projects for that county. But our projects look at Lake County, Dyer County, Lauderdale County, and Madison County, specifically impacting flood resilience and impacts to riverine flooding. We're doing a host of different projects that involve traditional infrastructure around water and sewer, also looking at some low-impact recreational facilities. We're looking at a low-impact designed for a tourism outpost, essentially in Lauderdale County, that will also include some educational components about flooding and some resilience along that line. And then working with the West Tennessee River Basin Authority to deal with restoration of natural wetlands and native plant species to deal with flooding impacts better. And then lastly, we have a grant through the that we've awarded to the University of Memphis that they're working with Vanderbilt and then also TDEC on a myriad of different data and analysis pieces that look at everything from Mississippi River supply chain and how that's affected to enhanced mitigation efforts and some educational components as well. Since then, we've taken some efforts to incorporate some additional resilience efforts in some of our day-to-day grant making and program management, particularly around infrastructure development. So this last year, we did a small grant for infrastructure planning that looks at specifically water and sewer for small and distressed systems across the distressed rural systems across the state. We've also incorporated planning and asset management of your water and sewer infrastructure into some of the CDBG regular round scoring. And then while it's not directly focused on disaster resilience, the department has increased its efforts for investment of economic development in our rural areas as well. And one of the things we do know is that a more diverse local economy can lead to better response to impact from any type of disaster. One of the big things that we've really learned throughout all of this process over the last few years is that collaboration was not something that we were doing very well before, and it's something that we've done a lot better since, particularly with TDEC and TEMA here, which I guess is why the three of us are sitting here. But we still have a long way to go in some aspects, but one area that I think we are doing a lot better is particularly around understanding where the funding from each other's departments goes, how we can collaborate and complement those better. Again, I do think that this is going to be a conversation that continues, and we will continue to improve those efficiencies. But considering that, at least in the recent history, I can't remember us working together as well as we are right now. As far as where I think what would be helpful for us to look at heading forward is, number one, I think it would be a great service for the state of Tennessee if we could develop a clear and unified definition of what community resilience looks like for us. Where we stand right now is that every department is kind of doing things differently. Again, luckily we're communicating well, so I think we're in that vein, but I think if we were able to determine that, for the state of Tennessee, this is what our definition of resilience is going to be, it will provide a lot of clarity and then direction as far as programming and funding decisions as we look to enhance those things in the future. And then the other thing is that we really need to, in my opinion, look at more continued funding and technical support for our water and sewer system infrastructure, especially in our rural areas. Those tend to be some of the hardest hit, particularly around flooding. Obviously, housing is always a concern when we're dealing with flooding, but for the things that we address and our typical grantees and stakeholders being the communities themselves, the number of times that we've seen real inundation to these aging water and sewer systems has been pretty catastrophic in some cases, and the need is only exacerbated by the age and the deterioration of the systems that we're in. So, I think the more that we can do on the front end, by the time that flooding really comes around, because we know it's going to continue flooding, especially in certain parts of the state, probably more so than others, that we'll be better prepared and our systems will be better prepared to handle those disasters, and then also get back online quicker if they are offline.
Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Kendra Apkowitz. I am Director of the Office of Policy and Sustainable Practices with the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. Thank you, Kent, for your great remarks. I look forward to hearing what Director Sheehan also has to share. I imagine you're going to hear some consistent themes from all of us, the leading theme there being collaboration. As Kent mentioned, over the past 3 to 4 years, we've really invested quite a bit of resources in trying to, again, understand how everybody views resilience, what each agency contributes, and then how we can better collaborate and leverage resources moving forward. The concept of resilience, so Tyler provided a great definition. There are several definitions out there. And Kent mentioned the importance of identifying a definition for the state of Tennessee. But this concept is highly interdisciplinary and is important to Tennessee communities across the state. In fact, it's so interdisciplinary that I imagine the vast majority of state of Tennessee agencies have some connection or statutory responsibilities somehow connected to resilience. And so really building those bridges and understanding how each of our missions connect and can better lift up communities is really, really important. Kent spent some time speaking about the ECD Rural by Nature grant projects. We were a part of several of those, primarily those focusing on riverine flooding, wetlands restoration, and development of data, tools, and resources. So I won't spend any additional time speaking through that. But I did want to share some examples of how TDEC is working in the resilience space, identify some potential future opportunities for collaboration, and what I think would be helpful in terms of really allowing us to maximize our work in the resilience space. We are currently engaging and historically have engaged in quite a bit of work in the water and wastewater infrastructure space. Many of you may be aware that we are the agency that houses Tennessee's Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund program. So that's a program that offers low interest loans to cities, counties, utility districts, and water and wastewater authorities for various different wastewater and drinking water projects. As you all know, drinking water and the ability to get rid of your wastewater are hugely important to a community being able to thrive, and so this is very much connected to community resilience. In addition to that basic connection to community resilience and access to clean water, our state revolving fund program is also piloting efforts to increase knowledge and practice of projects that focus on solving current resilience issues, so things such as water loss, flood resilience, and asset management. So we've selected 4 communities to pilot those projects with, and we'll be working with those communities to really document their experience in trying to implement some practices that address, as I mentioned, flood resilience, water loss, and asset management, and then developing toolkits and resources moving forward that we can offer to communities to help connect them with those resources and learn from those examples and success stories. As Kent mentioned, we've also spent quite a bit of time, those of us who do work in the water and wastewater infrastructure space, collaborating. So we've been working with ECD, CDBG, USDA Rural Services, the Comptroller, Tennessee Association of Utility Districts, various other parties to really understand how to leverage technical and financial resources. We all have a lot to bring to the table, but if we're not coordinating together, we're not maximizing our impact. And so being able to align our priorities will, I think, give a bigger bang for the buck for communities and maximize how we can support our communities across the state of Tennessee. You also may be familiar with a current effort that we have ongoing called TNH2O. We engaged over the past approximately year and a half, 2 years, developing through a multi-agency effort a plan for future water availability. I briefly moments ago mentioned the importance of clean water and getting rid of wastewater And so actually having water resources available is also very important. And so this was a plan that was coordinated by TDEC. It included various different state partners, federal partners, lots of other nonprofits and organizations active in this space. And so the goal was to identify a path forward as to how Tennessee can ensure that it has abundant water resources now and into the future. So we're now working through the process of developing some actions that we can put into place based on that plan, and look forward to giving you all updates as to how that work is progressing over the next several years. We've also recently launched a pilot program that we're calling Sustainable Resilience for Communities, where we're facilitating risk and resilience strategic planning sessions with a subset of communities across the state. So those communities had to apply for that offering. It's a technical assistance offering. At this point, there's no funding involved in it. But it was developed in response to stakeholder requests, where we are working through a strategic and consensus building process to work with those communities to identify priorities and action steps that they can take to make their communities more resilient. We're getting ready to host those workshops over this spring, and based on how that process unfolds and if it's successful and communities find value in it, it's a program that we're considering rollout. And so obviously as we work with those, those communities, while we are focused on resilience generally, most of the priorities we're tackling have some tie back to the Department of Environment and Conservation's mission. And so if you want to learn more about that program, I'd be happy to share information with you all about that. Again, it is a pilot program, so whether or not we move forward with it is to be determined. We collaborate in rolling out that program. We're collaborating quite a bit with our counterparts at TEMA and ECD and looping them into those processes where specific communities have identified priorities that also touch on their responsibilities and mission. We also coordinate and collaborate very frequently with TEMA in the emergency support function and emergency response space. So we have energy assurance functions within the Department of Environment and Conservation. Our subject matter experts throughout the agency play a significant role in working with TEMA to assist local governments in the environmental response space. We also have debris management plans to support communities in recovering from disasters that they may experience. We play a role in the drought management space, and then also work with drinking water facilities on emergency planning and security measures that they have to have on place to make sure that they're able to provide adequate drinking water supply to communities. Kent also briefly touched on the West Tennessee River Basin Authority. That entire authority serves a 20-county area in West Tennessee and is affiliated with our department. Their primary goal is to preserve the natural flow and function of West Tennessee streams and rivers. So through their restoration projects, they're very focused on restoring, again, those natural functions and community abilities to absorb impacts associated with flooding events. We also offer a myriad different grants focused on various priorities that touch on aspects of resilience, so protecting green spaces, implementing local parks and recreation facilities, healthy watersheds, and responsible management of waste. In terms of moving forward, I think, as Kent mentioned, determining a definition for resilience will be hugely helpful so that we can better identify the scope of work that we all believe contributes to resilience, and then identify more opportunities for agencies to collaborate. So until we have that definition as a state, it becomes difficult to know exactly who needs to be brought into that conversation and what resources are available for leveraging. I also believe moving forward, what would be helpful is a better understanding once we have that definition of how each agency contributes to resilience. Again, that I believe will facilitate conversations about how we can better collaborate and leverage our resources, both financial and technical, to really support communities across the state. I believe it's also important moving forward that we align our efforts. Agencies are pulled in quite a bit of directions. Sometimes they're pulled by federal government, sometimes they are pulled by current state government agency, state government leadership, and sometimes they're pulled by local community priorities as well, and various other different stakeholders. And so without properly aligning all of our efforts, sometimes we can become very resource constrained and perhaps have our hands in too many buckets, whereas we may have more of an impact if we all focus on one thing. And so I think moving forward, one thing that could be helpful is understanding how tackling the concept of resilience may actually have some positive alignment with other initiatives going on at the state government level. I know that supporting rural communities is a very significant priority right now within the state of Tennessee, and so there may be an opportunity for us to figure out how resilience can be a piece of that. Similarly, infrastructure development is a major focus area, and so what aspect of resilience can really, really support infrastructure development? And so that way, I think we're all moving in the same direction. And so with that, I will turn it over to Director Sheehan.
Thank you, Director Sheehan. I was just wondering if you were getting any text over the noise we were hearing in here. I thought you might be the first to know. You'd give us a little hand signal if there was a problem.
If there was a problem, I would have asked you all to follow me through whatever exit was appropriate. I assure you of that. So.
Thank you.
So thanks for allowing me to be here today. My name is Patrick Sheehan. I am the director of the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency. It's a position I've been blessed and privileged to hold for about 3.5 years. It was a position I was recruited to in 2016, and I moved my family. I'm originally from Georgia, but I moved my family a quarter of the way across the country from Ohio to be here in Tennessee, and it has been a blessing from the first day that I've been here. I have the privilege of knowing most of the county mayors there and a number of you that are there, and we have worked together already in this 3.5 years on disaster response and mitigation. And in my tours of counties, mayors, you may remember that the first thing I bring up when I meet with you is about mitigation and the importance of mitigation and the fact that before I got here, I feel that Tennessee had underinvested in efforts in mitigating disasters and the importance of state and local government working together to create a safer, more resilient Tennessee. You probably remember me saying those exact words to you in 2017 and 2018. The next slide here is TEMA's mission. This is really extracted from, so we redid our strategic plan. This is extracted from the legislative intent in the statute that establishes TEMA, Tennessee Code Annotated 582102, the legislative intent. So 3 paragraphs there that charter the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency. And I'm not going to read it to you guys. You guys are, a number of you have been in the legislature or on the legislature, and the intent here, though, is about a compelling interest for the state of Tennessee and how to create resilience. And so this is our mission. We just kind of edited it so it would fit more cleanly. It's not pithy, but it is the brass tacks of why the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency was created and what we do, what we try to do. Sometimes we've not done it well. I think it's useful to define disasters and the characteristics of disasters. So, you know, a tree that falls in the wood, you know, the woods, if it doesn't make any noise, right, if no one's there to hear it, it's not really a disaster. But disasters are a confluence of human systems and nature and technology sometimes. And so spatially, they're very predictable, right? They're going to happen where people are. They're going to happen where there's a river, there's going to be floods. And human settlements are built around rivers, and we're blessed with rivers here in Tennessee, water resources, and that's going to lead to disasters sometimes. Wastewater treatment plants are always located at the lowest point in a city. And if they're not, then you're actually building in other infrastructure dependencies that can cascade disasters, that can create other problems when power goes out and lift stations lose the ability to lift water. And I've seen tens of millions of dollars in damage done in other places, and certainly in Tennessee in 2010 has happened here. The other thing about disasters, they're random at a rate. That's a scientific way of saying we don't know when they're going to happen. So we know generally where they're going to happen, but we don't know when. And that leads to anxiety, that kind of uncertainty leads to questions about how do we invest. And I know when you guys met in December, you had presentations about earthquakes and the New Madrid seismic zone, the East Tennessee seismic zone. And, you know, in 1811 and 1812, massive earthquakes reshaped the topography of West Tennessee, southeastern Missouri, Kentucky, Illinois. Massive earthquakes changed the course of the river. Reelfoot Lake did not exist before 1812. I mean, just think about that. If you've ever seen Now, it's very shallow, but the size of the lake there, that's the type of seismic energy, the geological energy that is stored that poses risk to us. And if you think, too, that when those happened, almost nobody lived in those areas. And now across those areas, we have pipelines, we have bridges, we have populations, we have a dependency on the Mississippi River for commerce that we never could have envisioned at that point in time. And so you overlay the human dimension over these geologic and these hydrologic risks, and that's where we have it. And we cannot predict the time. We just know that they're going to happen. And we can prepare to be wrong in some ways, right? So that's where building codes come into play. We kind of know how high the water will get in certain places. But my friend Brock Long was fond of reminding me that he would ask me a question. He would say, "Hey, Patrick, does it rain where you are?" I said, "Of course it rains where I am, Brock." He said, "Well, then it can flood where you are." And so all of us have some level of flood risk, but we know that as our human understanding is getting better, we understand better where we're vulnerable and how we're vulnerable and what we can do about it. And you add that, too, that our infrastructure is getting older. There are still places in this nation that have wooden water mains. I venture to say, and TDEC can probably tell me for sure, that there are wooden water mains in places in Tennessee. I know there were in Ohio, and they're hard to find when there's a leak, and they're going to leak. And so every water system in the nation has leakage, right? And if they're pushing 75% treated water to the end point, that's considered success. But that's a lot of water that gets wasted. And so that's where we find ourselves today. And so we invest in resilience, and we do that monetarily, and we do that with effort, and we do that by structures and laws and codes and by making choices. And in Tennessee, one of the things that's been the biggest delight for me is looking back over the last 50 years is government here has been really smart about a lot of things. We care about being good stewards of dollars. So when I look back in the legislature, and I didn't grow up in Tennessee, so I say this as someone that had to learn about it. Whether the Democrat-led or Republican-led legislatures or executive branches, there have been smart decisions made for the future, a very strong future orientation. When I was a kid growing up in North Georgia, Chattanooga was not a place you wanted to go. The air was dirty, the water was dirty, the food wasn't very good, the traffic was still somehow snarled. But the city fathers there, the county fathers there, the folks in that area had a long-term vision, and they knew they could make choices to make that city, that area, one of the jewels of the Southeast. And when I grew up in Kennesaw, Georgia, I never thought I'd talk about Chattanooga as being a jewel, but it is a jewel. It is a place that is a destination, almost as much a destination as Gatlinburg. Maybe not quite, but it's getting there. But disaster resilience, Dr. Abkowitz was talking about how do we define resilience. So I think this is it can be usefully defined, right? That we recognize and are prepared for risks, that we are able to adapt to those changing conditions, because things are changing, and that we respond to and recover from disasters successfully. So we've had 2 disasters in Tennessee that were federally declared, major disasters this year, and the recovery from those will go on for a while. We are still recovering from the 2010 floods, and will be for some time still. And I would advise you, I saw the Tennessean referred to them as the Nashville floods, but if you ever go west of here, they will bristle at calling them the Nashville floods. So it is the 2010 floods. I think it was 32 counties flooded in 2010 there. But we invest dollars, too. And so from 1963 to 2019, we've invested just FEMA dollars, or FEMA's precursor dollars, $187,861,968 in resilience. Because mitigation for me is resilience. If you read FEMA's mitigation plan, it's a framework for resilience. If you read the guidance about developing a mitigation plan, it is a framework for resilience at the local level. If you read anything that we have written or published from TEMA since my arrival on June 13th, 2016, it is about helping you have resilient communities so we can be a more resilient state. Because that is what good, smart government does. Recovery funding dwarfs this, though. So nearly half of this is the 2010 flood. But it's nearly $800 million just in federal recovery funds to help communities get back on their feet. And that doesn't count the number of times we've had incidents happen that don't meet the thresholds or the criteria for the federal government. And it doesn't count the fact that Tennessee almost always splits the difference, the 25% local cost share, and almost always pays 12.5%, if not more, with those local communities. And so we have a road to resilience, right? So we have faced tremendous disasters, literally earth-shaping disasters here, from the New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 to 1812. And it was a series, and there's a logarithmic scale, and it's more than I understand, but you get some precursor ones, and you get the big one. And the only reason you know that it's the big one and not an aftershock is it's bigger than the ones that preceded it, right? And then every day they kind of go down by half. And the Waverly train disaster. So we have technological hazards too, right? We have railroads that carry lots of hazardous materials across the state. Sometimes, they almost always run near water sources too. So that presents a risk. The 2010 floods were a tremendous disaster here. 2016, when I came here, my second week here, we had flash flooding and storm damage from Stewart County to Carter County. It was a great way for me to learn the county names in the state of Tennessee, because I did not know them at the time. I'm still hard-pressed if you were to put a map in front of me. But that then turned into a significant drought, an extreme drought, all 95 counties affected, and culminated on the 28th of November 2016 with the worst wildfire that the state of Tennessee has ever seen, the second worst wildfire, I think, in history east of the Mississippi River, and the second worst fire in Tennessee history. The only one that exceeds it is the 1916 East Nashville fire, rather. And then this year, just as an example, last year now, the Chattanooga water main break. We're going to have more water main breaks. But TEMA and our partners, other state agencies, have all been engaged with everything but the 1811-1812 earthquake. So whether that's we're anticipating and we're talking about through our experiences and our planning and our risk assessments that we know when the water main breaks that hospitals are going to have to go on diversion. And that's going to tax hospital systems. And we communicate with our partners there. We know that the community colleges and University of Tennessee Chattanooga are going to have to send students to other places. And some of those students won't be able to go because they're international students. They don't have any family or friends or homes to go back to here easily. And so we're working all the time to identify these complexities, these downrange, unintended consequences, unseen consequences to help manage them. And I know in Ottawa, there was flooding from, I think in some places in Ottawa were underwater from October of 2018 until May of 2019. And that was with us putting pumps there and siphoning water out and trying to get it back into, making sure that we weren't going to flood other people and still get it back into the water systems, the drainage systems. But we are the birthplace of innovation in emergency management and disaster management here. The all hazards taxonomy was born here, this idea that we handle disasters comprehensively here, that we don't try to segment them or separate them, was born here in Tennessee. In emergency management, the worldwide planning doctrine about emergency support functions, those concepts that no one organization can do everything by themselves, was born here, and that's why we created emergency support functions. Those were born at 3041 Sidco Drive when Lacey Suter was the director here. And if you guys don't know him, I encourage you to look at him. Great Tennessean. The National Distinguished Service in Emergency Management Award is named for Lacey Suter. The first person to receive the award was the director I worked for in Ohio, though, so which may or may not have influenced my decision to come here. But this planning doctrine, this idea about how we can work together is born here. And TEMA, and the mayors can attest to this, you don't just see our staff, you've seen me. Because it's important that we work together. And it's important, too, that the first time you see me or hear my name isn't when a disaster is already struck. And county executive, I know I keep saying mayor, but I'm talking about you too, sir. But we invest together, we plan together, and we collaborate together, which, quite frankly, is what TEMA is established to do. So we have a vision. So we did this new strategic plan this year, and this is the kind of an extrapolation. I'm going to read a longer thing here, though, about how we're thinking about disaster management and resilience in Tennessee. We envision a future where rains fall and rivers rise, and no homes or businesses are flooded, where memories and keepsakes and family wealth are not lost. We envision structures that continue to stand safely, even when the strongest storms blow and communities recover from the worst disasters. We envision robust infrastructure that survives calamity and is modular and adaptable enough to allow for quick and cost-effective repair. We envision a future where the emergency management community, first responders, public safety forces, public works departments, and all partners in crisis and disaster response respond with unity of effort, each sharing information and working together across disciplines and across jurisdictional lines, seamlessly to those outside and easily for those inside, bringing to bear the skills and knowledge and expertise and resources they need in an understanding of both their individual roles and the larger effort of response. This future is one where we train together, exercise across disciplines and jurisdictions, forge lasting relationships and partnerships, and build stronger competencies. We plan together using the best standards available and practices and evidence. We envision an emergency management system that is fast, quick to respond, and unencumbered by bureaucracy because processes have been developed, written, and streamlined with teammates who are trained and tested under stress. We envision seamless disaster recovery where federal support is leveraged with state and local resources, donations and services from NGOs and volunteers to help Tennesseans and communities rebuild their homes, businesses, and communities stronger than they were before. We envision a future where Tennesseans know that their government, state and local, with federal support, and Tennessee's producers, industries, companies, and voluntary organizations are competent and forever endeavoring to improve capabilities and resilience and build a safer Tennessee, a more resilient Tennessee for all. That's our vision, and that's what we're trying to work towards now. And we do follow an all-hazards approach. The all-hazards taxonomy is the one we use. And so we don't try to segment out, this is flood risk, this is this risk, because the capabilities needed for each of those things are cross-cutting. And so you don't build a flood response team that's only good for one place. You build them so that capability can be shared. We don't just do critical infrastructure restoration teams for water for one jurisdiction. We do them so that they can be shared rapidly across the state, and we support that. By having these managed under a single umbrella, we have better opportunities for synergies, we have better opportunities to work together and make sure that we're not wasting resources. And I will point out that in our mitigation planning, which is done with hundreds of partners and was republished in 2018, we identified 13 hazards of prime concern. So whether that's drought and earthquake, and so these are here for you to see. And then we have mitigation strategies for each of those. Some of them cost money, but some of them don't. Those are actions that can be taken across the state and local governments. And it's not easy reading. It's like 600 pages with appendixes, but it's valuable. So in action, since I've been here, we've had a renewed emphasis on mitigation. Our local mitigation plan adoption was terrible when I got here. And we've restructured to be able to support the counties and the cities as they adopt and rewrite mitigation plans. It's not easy. It's not. You make hard choices. You make trade-offs. And there'll be people not happy about things. But we are supporting our communities, the 95 counties and certain cities, with doing these things. We're supporting them with funding so they can do buyouts of communities that we know are going to flood when it rains, as our understanding of where it floods gets better. And for the state of Tennessee, we're pursuing an enhanced mitigation status. What that means for us would be an additional 5%. So like after a disaster, say a disaster is a $100 million disaster for public assistance, we would get $20 million right now for mitigation. Well, if you get an enhanced status, we'd get $25 million. And so there's a long process to go through. It requires us to be better at certain things that we have never done. And we're undertaking those. And it's part of our state's strategy to have this done in the next 2 years. And I hope to be done before that. But right now, like local mitigation plans cover 84 federally approved mitigation plans now cover 84% of Tennessee's population. That's the highest percentage ever. It matches Kentucky's, and it's better in terms of population covered by mitigation plans. It makes us among the best in the nation. And that's just through work in the last 2.5 years. Now, we do a lot of support with local jurisdictions. District coordinators, planners at the regional offices go out to help our communities build resilience, because we can talk about it at the state, and there's certain levers we can pull directly at the state, but most of it will happen at the local level. And we need to make it easier and more apparent for the policymakers at a local level to have the information so that they can act appropriately. And there's links here. I think you guys will have this spreadsheet, but there's data here about where your planning is at the local level. There's data here about what the risks you face are, where the hazards occur most frequently. And there's also about what kinds of projects get funded most quickly. It's good information to have here, and it's things that we've developed in the last year to assist local policymakers, to democratize this information, to make it easier for everybody to access it and act on it. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Questions? I'm sorry, Mayor McDonald?
Are you going to get us copies of their comments?
Can we? Sure. Will you do that and distribute those for us? Yeah, we'll get that done.
Thank you.
Senator Yarborough.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Archer, I mean, just because you've had some experience with this, like I'm curious about in the context of these grants that happened. And then, Director, I mean, I'll fine with anybody commenting on it. The collaboration, I think, is where you just obviously have complications because, as you say, every department is involved. If there's a prison in a community, then TDOC is involved. If there's roadways through, then TDOT's involved. If, and you've got private sector. If the Memphis airport floods, FedEx has a plan, right? I mean, I think and then at the county level, you've got county and state governments, you've got school systems, you've got all the different departments inside of cities. And I mean, I'm sure everyone here, cities, everyone gets along all the time, but occasionally we, in Nashville at least, I've seen some departments and groups aren't always on the same page on priorities. How did you sort of try to bridge those divides about kind of the, internal to state government, then out to local governments and regional areas, and also private sector, in building out those grants, and how should we think about that go forward?
Yeah, so particularly with those grants, we did focus the majority of our efforts in the development of the grants and then even post in trying to coordinate more with our state counterparts first. One of the things that we tried to do in the wake of the grant that was kind of a sister initiative to it, but it's stalled out for right now. We'd like to see it revived in some way is a resilience council. I think part of it was just the timing, and again, that was something that is a little bit of a difficult lift, not really knowing where we were headed as in terms of resilience as a state. But I think one of the things that we definitely learned from that is that everybody does look at it differently, that it's incredibly important to have those conversations, and really we need to be having more of those conversations on the front end. Part of it is I think we have the opportunity to take a little bit of a page kind of from the way that TEMA deals with developing hazard mitigation plans and just their planning process in general, is that we should be able to develop some type of, call it whatever you want to, but body, council, organization, whatever, at the state level that can provide as a template to mirror for our local communities so that they can really get an idea for who needs to be involved. I mean, one of the things that we've realized, and we, fortunately for us, have not had to go through this again, but there are from a federal perspective, there are two big chunks of money that come down with major disasters. There are the FEMA funds that Director Sheehan and TEMA really partner with and manage a lot of those. And then somewhere 2 to 4 years later, there may be an allocation of funds that Congress passes through a disaster allocation that comes down through HUD and usually contains all of the CDBG rules, regulations, and maybe have some additional pieces there too. There's a massive disconnect historically, and I would argue even at a federal level right now, we still see a disconnect because of lack of permanent authorization and some of that kind of stuff that I won't get too deep into. But one area that we really have noticed is that lag time between when the bulk of their work in the relative short term is done, so I'd say in that first year of recovery, and what is still outstanding by the time that maybe we get funds another 2 to 3 years later. We need to have more conversations up front, probably even before there's the potential of us receiving those funds, so that when those things become available, we're ready to use it. Also, on top of that, we need to know better what they're unable to address with their funding, because again, they're never given as much money as they need, so that we can make adjustments through our regular funding priorities. So CDBG, I mean, 75 to 80% of our money goes to water and sewer infrastructure. With some of the changes, and Kendra can speak better to this too, with some of the changes to what the SRF program, the State Revolving Fund program, has done at TDEC in some of their focuses, I mean, that's all they do. Us understanding where those gaps are and where those deficiencies still stand would really go a long way in how we can address those moving forward. And I think it's something, again, that we're working on, but that kind of answers your question. There's still a lot more bridge building that has to happen, but I think the biggest lesson learned is that with the Resilience Council, we started too big. It really has been a lot more helpful for us to pause on that, refocus. The three of our agencies are working really well right now. I think that we're kind of getting to that point where we should probably start incorporating more relatively soon. But that has been the biggest help, is that, you know, start small, figure out what you need for you, and then you can build from there.
All right. Other questions? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I think she was.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and I think it's probably different based on every community circumstance, every disaster we're faced with, because how that disaster unfolds, you know, as Director Sheehan, we can plan for these things, but at the same time, we really can't plan for them. I think it ultimately, you know, the conversation that we need to continually keep having and get more adept at having is what resources does each party have to provide to bring to the table, and how can we best maximize the use of those resources to address the challenge at hand. And I think that holds true both sort of in this this pre-disaster preparation and planning world. So how can we, again, get communities to take action now to better prepare themselves for being able to respond to those disasters that occur? But then also, how can we best help them recover over the long term? So I think it really spans the spectrum, also in the moment, in the actual emergency response moment. And I think how each agency contributes resources in each of those circumstances is very, very different. And so being able to have that conversation, and also to think very creatively. So beyond sort of here's what TDEC brings to the table. Well, if I think about how I can use this resource, here's how it can also meet ECD and TMA's needs, or Department of Health's needs. And so I think getting ourselves to be more comfortable thinking creatively and innovatively about how we can plug resources, whether those are technical or financial, in different circumstances, is something that I just think we need to do, and we'll get better at doing it over time. I think maintaining momentum is also a huge challenge. I think I'm always so pleased to see how resources are rallied in the moment, in the wake of a disaster, and then we all, I imagine, we just collectively, the public, make commitments to do more, to do better next time, and then we tend to forget a little bit in some circumstances. And so how do we maintain the momentum and enthusiasm to really rally together, think collaboratively and collectively, and make change so something like that doesn't happen in the future?
I would just add, collaboration is always hard, right? I mean, even if we were all on a team, or we all played for the Titans, right? And we all had our positions, and we knew what our role was. It's still hard, right? And you see it. That's why the Titans were able to obliterate Baltimore, I think, because they had their assignments down better. But collaboration is just always hard. But I think that's, for me, when I think about emergency management and when I look at how we're established, that is what we're supposed to do. And there have been times where we have not done it well. But I think we're in an era right now where we are doing it really well. And there's challenges. CDBG DR comes in late. And there's a number of states that have tackled that and handled that different ways. North Carolina assigned it to NCEM. And, they've been on the receiving end of multi-billion dollars of damage over the last several years. But I know my counterpart, Mike Spraybrae, runs that over there in North Carolina, just to our east. And so there's a number of different ways to handle it. We do have a system. Sometimes it's uneven in its application and how it works on how we're supposed to collaborate. But the emergency management system is the one system that's kind of unified in this state, where every county, or if there's not an EM director, the county mayor, is the point of contact, the representative that's supposed to coordinate disaster preparedness and response. The cities are encouraged, but the counties are required. And the county mayors know, the county executives know, there's not a lot of things spelled out in Tennessee Code Annotated where you're required to do it. Disaster preparedness is one of those areas. And that's why we put a lot of effort in helping support each of those communities, because we'll never be able to scale the necessary manpower to handle everything, not even locally, but working together we can come pretty doggone close. So we do have a system, and I think there's ways to strengthen it sometimes, and there's sometimes where personalities or just life gets in the way and slows things down. But I think we have opportunities to continue the momentum we have and get better.
Mayor Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The resiliency grant, Mr. Archer, let me ask you, that grant, that was when it started 3 years ago? The
Yes,
$44.5 million?
Yes.
Yeah, and so how much of that $44.5 million has been spent?
So we've expended roughly between 35 and 40%.
35 and 40%, and
Yes,
the
sir.
rest of it by 2022?
Yes, sir.
So it's, what's that, 5 or 6 years?
Altogether, about 5 years of grant, and then if you factor in the year and a half or so of application and planning, yeah.
Yeah, is the length of time it takes, is that just the difficulty and the complexity of the grant because it's based on natural disasters that occurred in other areas of the country? And is it specific to this grant, or is it just a difficult, is it complex because there's so many different agencies that are involved?
It's a little bit of both. There are, to your point, with some of the pre-NDR, HUD is in, the federal government have changed a little bit of the way that they handle some of these. So going forward in some of the regular round, that's not regular round, but some of the just general disaster allocations, they've incorporated some of these elements of NDR, the timelines being part of that, and that 5 years is kind of a mainstay. Before then, there are still grants from 2008, Ike and Katrina, stuff like that, open in Louisiana and Alabama. I would be willing to bet that going forward with some of these really, really large allocations, we will see years extended well beyond the 5 years. We looked at something not that long ago, and from 92 through, I think, 2017 is all they've done so far. What we've been able to see is that in the last 4 years, 47% of all the funding related to disaster allocations has come in that last 4 years. So we're seeing bigger and worse disasters, and we're seeing more expensive recoveries out of that, which means that, I'd be hard-pressed to think that Puerto Rico is going to be able to spend their money in 5 years. Even if they were the best financially run territory, state, commonwealth around, between all the allocations they've got now, they're well over $20 billion. That's it's an enormous amount. But back to your point, I do think that a lot of it, some of it is just the way that the money flows, the regulations around it. And so a lot of it does have to do with the complexity.
But this grant does not have a low to moderate income component in it at all, does it?
It did with the application, yes, sir.
It did?
It did.
I guess I'm struggling with, why would you have a low to moderate income component in a mitigation grant? I mean,
yeah, and part of that is, so it's usually just a portion of the money has to be spent on low to moderate income, not necessarily all of it. And the reason for that is that when HUD looks at it, a lot of the times our most affected by disasters are most impoverished populations. So those still kind of go hand in hand. What they really try and stop is, like, if you look at what happened with Superstorm Sandy, they don't want people spending all of their money, building or rebuilding multi-million-dollar houses on.
Yeah, I guess I just struggle with the low to moderate income component when you're looking at a flooding natural disaster, and it floods everybody. It's not a matter of how much money you got; it's a matter of your elevation, where you are. So that's going to comprise low to moderate income and other folks as well in a flood-prone area. And if you're going to mitigate that area, you're going to mitigate all of it, aren't you? Or
yes.
not?
Yeah, we certainly would, and that would be the goal. And I think that also speaks to a little bit of what Kendra was talking about too, with making sure that we're utilizing the best resources available, because one of the constraints of using CDBG funds is we have that low to moderate income stipulation, which makes it not necessarily usable all the time. And so are there better sources of funding at certain times that we should be using for, whether that's the state or local government, to really accomplish what we really need to have accomplished? But I completely agree with your assessment that disasters, they don't look at incomes, they don't look at political boundaries, any of that.
Right. Yeah, well, thank you all for your presentation. And let me say, Director Sheehan, you're awfully easy to work with from a local standpoint. You do come see us. You're down there. It's makes a big deal and a big difference when the State Emergency Management Agency works well with you locally, and you and your people have, and I thank you for that.
I'll give Jane Waldrop all the credit in West Tennessee for being awesome to work with.
Well, I know you worked with Mayor Waters too, and if you can work with him, you can work with anybody.
In that regard, he's asked to be recognized. Mayor Waters.
I'd appreciate it in the future if you'd cut off Mayor Huffman's mic at the appropriate time, Mr. Chairman.
We'll take that under advisement.
A couple of quick comments and then a question, and I second what Jeff has said here. I've worked with Director Sheehan very closely. We literally had trial by fire right after he got here. All of us were in, and they did a tremendous job working in Sevier County. A couple of things, before this disaster, and I can tell you all that you heard Director Sheehan talk about the county's role, and you have a plan and you sign off on that plan. Well, I was like a lot of other people. When the EMA director come in with a plan, I'd say, give me the highlights, and here I'm getting ready to sign it, and you call me if you need me. I don't do that now. Let me say, when I sit down with our EMA people and go over the plan, I look at it in detail and try to understand how we need to react to different situations, and much more involved in it. So I'd encourage you to be involved in it before you have a disaster, more involved. Right. And the second thing is that we tried to learn from our mistakes. We did an after-action review of what happened. We tried to understand what went well, and we tried to understand what didn't go well. And those things that didn't go well, we made a list of them, and we still meet to this day with the city folks and our EMA department, and we're still going over things that we can improve in a disaster. And that's critical that you learn from any situation like that. And I'd encourage you, I'd be happy to share with anybody some of the recommendations that we had of this study that we did. It was an international firm, and we spent a lot of money, and they made some good ones, and we're trying to go through that. But my last item is just a question, I guess, to you, Director Sheehan. After the fires, we worked with TEMA, we worked with FEMA, and let me say TEMA is much easier to work with than FEMA is. FEMA was good for, as long as they had, I've said this several times, as long as they had someone on site that can make decisions, great organization. When that person left and you had to go to Atlanta and D.C. for decisions, you're in trouble because, then things come to a halt. But as long as there was a person there that I could go sit down with or call Director Sheehan, and we could call that person and they could make a decision about whatever it was, it worked well. But when that person left, I can't say much about how well it worked, but the team did do a great job. But Governor Haslam at that time appointed Commissioner Martineau as sort of the key person to coordinate from a cabinet level assistance in Sevier County and the city of Gatlinburg. And that seemed to work well because I was able to, and as well as the mayor of Gatlinburg and city manager, called Director Sheehan, but we also called Commissioner Martineau, not just with TDEC issues, but with any issue we had. He was the key person. He went to the governor, he went to the other cabinet members and worked with us to work through those issues. Do you see that, Director Sheehan, as a model for future major disasters? Because it seemed to work well.
So that may have had something to do with the fact that I was very new. The way that the Tennessee Code Annotated is written is I am the governor's authorized representative, the TEMA director, not just me, and the state coordinating officer. And at the time, I was very new, less than 5 months in the state of Tennessee. So I think that played a role in Governor Haslam's decision at that time. And, Commissioner Martineau was steady and long experience in Tennessee. So I think contrast that with someone that had just moved here and was 40 years old. I think that played a role in that.
So you see in future, and hopefully we don't have any, but unfortunately we probably will, that instead of a person in the cabinet like that being appointed, that you were going to take on that role, and in the future we would contact you and you would coordinate with cabinet members, whether it be TDEC or transportation, or whatever that needs to happen on the local level. You see you being just that person that's going to do that, right?
I would expect so. I can't speak to, I will, of course, do whatever Governor Lee wants to do and support whatever system, and I work for Governor Lee.
Right.
So, but that said, the system is set up so that we already have someone that does that, and that person is the director of TEMA.
Right. So you don't envision that kind of a situation?
I would imagine we would convene policy groups like that. There was a lot of complicating factors with the wildfire. There was a lot of contentious things in the recovery, and it required a lot of attention. I think it was a way for Governor Haslam to focus the government at that time on what needed to be done to get Sevier County. And there was also the places that were impacted by the tornadoes.
Yeah,
the next
correct. Day. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Seeing none, thank you. That was an excellent presentation. I do want to mention that last time we had a meeting, I was interested in what we could publish as to what can the average family do. Government's never going to be able to respond on a one-to-one basis. Foolish of us to think or give the impression we can. Do you want to address that just to make Dr. Lippert? There's a great attachment to this report that every mom and dad in Tennessee needs to read.
And I believe Tyler referred to this briefly in his introduction, but yes, it's right behind the memo in tab 12, an excellent list of actions individuals can take to be prepared to mitigate for their own scale for disasters. Of course, we lifted this from TEMA's website, which and kind of boiled it down, but they have that resource as well as several other resources, and then Tyler has included other links that are useful at the end
It's
of
a
that
great
document.
report.
So.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank each of you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've made it through another one. I want to first stop and thank the commission. Your questions are always very pointed and shows great interest and study and dramatically improves, I think, what we learn from our panels. So to each commission member, thank you for coming up and fighting the traffic and spending the night and finding a place to park and come back. I'm still working on that, failing miserably. I might want to go ahead and add to that. But thank you to all the commission members. I'm not sure people throughout Tennessee realize what sacrifice you make and the benefit we get from it. To our staff, again, I don't recall any meeting where our staff has done any better job dealing with extremely difficult issues. So to our staff, we all say to you a job well done, and Doc, you're doing a great job with them, and they're doing a good job, so thank you so much. Our next meeting is either May the 6th, 7th, or May 13, 14. What's your pleasure? Mayor McDonald.
Mr. Chairman, May the 7th is National Day of Prayer, so a number of us would have things back home that we would need to attend. If it works for everybody else, I would propose 13, 14.
Anyone have any other questions, comments, or do we need to look for another day?
We can pray about it.
Looks like May 13, 14 is okay. All right, May 13 and 14, we'll be back then. We're going to the far reaches of the state, so God bless you and have safe travels. And again, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. We are adjourned.